They fired the wrong man. Not because he was weak, not because he was incompetable, but because they never once bothered to look past the name tag pinned to his work vest. Within 72 hours of that termination letter being signed, an entire billion-dollar board of directors would sit in absolute silence, nobody daring to breathe too loud, as the name Ethan Callaway appeared on the projection screen above their heads. This is the story of an ordinary father, a little girl who needed him, and the single phone call that brought an empire crashing down. If this story hits you somewhere real, drop a like and comment your city below. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The Tuesday that ruined everything started the same way every Tuesday did for Ethan Callaway. 5:15 in the morning. The alarm on his phone, an old cracked screen Android he kept meaning to replace, buzzed against the nightstand with all the urgency of a dying insect. He silenced it before the second vibration. 9 years of early mornings had trained him that way. His body just knew. He lay still for exactly 30 seconds, not sleeping, not thinking about anything meaningful, just existing in that quiet corridor between night and day where the world hadn't started demanding things from him yet. The ceiling had a water stain in the far left corner, shaped vaguely like the state of Florida. He'd noticed it the first week they moved into the apartment, and he still noticed it every morning. Some things you just stop trying to explain. Then he heard it, the small sound that actually got him out of bed every day. A cough from down the hall, soft, barely anything. Then the creak of a mattress spring, the shuffle of small feet, and the quiet click of a bathroom door. Sophie was awake. Ethan was already sitting up. He pulled on the gray sweatpants draped over the chair, the ones with the fraying left cuff that Sophie had told him 3 separate times looked embarrassing, and padded down the hall in socked feet. The apartment wasn't large. 3 rooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where the overhead light flickered when the refrigerator compressor kicked on. But Ethan had made it work. He'd been making things work since Sophie was 3 years old. He tapped on the bathroom door. "You good in there, bug?" "I'm fine, Dad." Her voice came through slightly muffled. 8 years old and already using the same flat, unbothered tone teenagers use when they want you to understand they don't need your help. "You don't have to check." "I know I don't have to." A pause. "Okay." "Okay." He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "You want eggs or the cereal with the little marshmallows?" Another pause, longer this time, weighing the options with the seriousness that only a child can bring to breakfast decisions. "Eggs, but not the rubbery kind." "When have I ever made them rubbery?" "Last Thursday." He didn't have a comeback for that because she wasn't wrong. He went to start the eggs. The kitchen smelled like coffee and dish soap. Morning light came through the window above the sink in thin, slanted lines, hitting the counter in a way that made the whole room look almost nice, almost like a place where everything was fine. Ethan started the coffee, then cracked 3 eggs into the pan. 2 for her, 1 for him, because he usually wasn't hungry in the mornings, but made himself eat anyway. Something he'd read once about men his age and metabolism. He didn't remember where he'd read it. He just remembered deciding to take it seriously. Sophie came out of the bathroom with her hair in a lopsided ponytail that she'd clearly attempted herself. She was wearing her blue hoodie with the small wolf patch on the sleeve and a pair of leggings that had a grass stain on the left knee from last weekend's park visit that had not, despite 2 wash cycles, fully surrendered. She climbed onto the bar stool at the kitchen counter and pulled her library book, a thick middle-grade novel about a girl who discovers her grandmother is secretly a cartographer for a magical underground railroad, toward her without a word. "Morning," Ethan said. "Morning." She turned a page. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine." Another page. Then, without looking up, "You put the leftovers in the wrong container again." Ethan looked at her. "What?" "The pasta. You put it in the big square container, but it should go in the round one because the round one has a better lid and it doesn't dry out as much." He slid her eggs onto a plate. "I've been putting things in containers for 32 years. And for 32 years, the pasta has probably been too dry." She finally looked up and gave him a look that was so precise, so completely certain of itself, that Ethan had to turn back to the stove to hide the fact that it made him want to laugh. She had her mother's eyes, dark and direct and completely unbothered by whoever was on the receiving end. He put the plate in front of her. She closed the book. "These look good," she said, in a slightly softer tone that was the closest she generally got to an apology. "I know." She ate. He stood at the counter with his coffee and watched the morning news on the small television mounted under the cabinet with the volume low. Nothing remarkable. Stock markets, weather, a story about a city council dispute over a parking structure that had apparently been in legal limbo for 11 years. It was an ordinary morning. That was the thing Ethan would keep coming back to later. It was completely, unremarkably ordinary. He dropped Sophie at school by 7:40. She jumped out of the truck without ceremony. This was the routine. They had an agreement that he would not walk her to the door because she was 8, not a baby, but she stopped with her hand on the door handle and looked back at him. "You working late tonight?" "Probably till 7. Mrs. Pacheco's got you from 3. Sophie made a face. "She lets her cat sit on the couch, and then the cat hair gets on my stuff." "The cat's name is Butterscotch, and he's elderly and doing his best." "He's not doing that great." "Sophie." "Fine." She pushed the door open. "I'll be nice to Butterscotch." "That's all I ask." She didn't wave, another part of the agreement, but as she walked toward the building entrance, she turned around once, just quickly, and gave him a look that didn't mean anything except, "I see you. I know you're there." Then she was through the door and gone. Ethan sat in the parking lot for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he drove to work. But Callaway Logistics and Warehouse, or rather, Sterling Callaway Logistics and Warehouse, as it had been renamed 18 months ago following the corporate merger, sat on the eastern edge of the Maplewood Industrial District. It was a functional building. Nobody had ever designed a warehouse to be beautiful, and nobody had tried here either. Concrete walls, loading docks lined up on the south face, a parking lot with potholes that facilities management had been promising to repair since the previous winter. The kind of place that worked because the people inside it worked. Ethan had been here for 6 years. He'd started as an inventory coordinator, moved to floor operations, and 3 years in had been made warehouse supervisor, a role that came with a slight pay bump, a lot more paperwork, and the specific exhausting responsibility of being the person everyone came to when something went wrong. And things always went wrong in a warehouse. That was the nature of the job. Pallets got mislabeled. Shipments arrived in the wrong bay. Somebody's forklift certification lapsed and there were new protocols to navigate. It never stopped. It just shifted shape. But Ethan was good at it. Not in a flashy way. In the way that a certain kind of person is good at hard things. Quietly, consistently, without needing anyone to notice. His team noticed. His crew of 14 knew that if Ethan told you something, it was true. If he made a call, it was thought through. He didn't play favorites, didn't pad his reports, didn't look the other way when something wasn't right. He was, by the particular standards of a place like this, an honest man, which is rarer than it sounds. He got to the floor by 8:10, already behind a day that didn't care. Marcus Webb, his lead forklift operator and the person whose opinion Ethan trusted most among the crew, fell into step beside him almost immediately. "Sterling's people are here again," Marcus said. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a close-cropped beard, going gray at the edges and a habit of delivering bad news in the same even tone he used for everything else. Ethan didn't slow down. "How many?" 3 suits, plus that guy Damien from Regional Ops. He's been walking the floor since 7. Ethan felt something tighten across his shoulders. Not panic. Something quieter and more specific. The way a carpenter might feel when he looks at a beam and isn't sure whether the problem is structural or cosmetic, but knows something is off. What's he looking at? Everything. Marcus paused. He's got a clipboard. Men with clipboards in a warehouse are almost never bringing good news. Ethan knew this from experience. "All right," he said, "let's just run the day clean. Everyone on task, no gaps. I don't want a single thing he can point at." Marcus nodded. "Already told the crew." "Good man." Wow. Damian Brooks was 44 years old, thin in the way that certain corporate men are thin. Like ambition had metabolized everything excess and left only the useful parts. He wore his suits pressed sharp and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never been the smartest person in a room, but had always been the most willing to use what he knew against other people. He'd moved through Sterling's corporate structure in the past few years the way water moves through cracks, finding weaknesses, filling spaces, never being entirely visible until the damage was already done. Ethan had met him 4 times. He had disliked him each time for reasons he couldn't completely articulate. It was something about the eyes. They moved too fast. They were always calculating something that wasn't the thing he was talking about. They crossed paths near Base 7 at 10:20. Damien looked up from his clipboard with a smile that arrived slightly before it should have. Calloway. He said the name like he was confirming something. Mr. Brooks. Ethan kept it professional. Anything I can help with today? Damien glanced around the floor with the detached assessment of a man who had already made up his mind and was simply collecting evidence to support it. Just routine compliance review. We've had some flagged items in the quarterly safety audit. Your sector. He tapped the clipboard without showing it. Few concerns. What kind of concerns? Documentation, mostly. He shrugged, and it was a very specific kind of shrug, one that said, "This is out of my hands," while also making absolutely clear that his hands were precisely where everything was. Incident logs, equipment maintenance records, some dates look inconsistent. Ethan looked at him steadily. I file every report personally. My dates are accurate. Of course. Another too early smile. We'll just want to cross-reference everything with central records. Should have more for you later this week. He clicked his pen, once, twice, a small power move dressed as a habit. Have a good morning, Calloway. He walked away. Ethan watched him go. Something was wrong. He didn't know what it was yet, or how wrong, or who else was involved. He just knew it the way you know a sound isn't right, even before you can name what's making it. He texted Marcus. Keep everything documented today. Every move, every load, every handoff. Written. Marcus texted back. On it. Should I be nervous? Ethan considered that for a moment. Not yet, he sent back. Ma. Victoria Sterling arrived at the Maplewood facility at 2 in the afternoon in a black car that was too clean for this part of the district. She stepped out in charcoal slacks and a cream blouse with her dark hair pulled back and a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. 30 years old, recently promoted, if you could call inheriting control of your family's company a promotion, and still in the process of figuring out which version of herself she needed to be in rooms like this one. She was smart. Genuinely, practically smart. Not just in the way that people who went to the right schools are sometimes mistaken for smart. She'd spent her 20s doing legitimate work in supply chain operations and logistics strategy, learning things the hands-on way because she'd decided early that being a Sterling shouldn't mean being decorative. When her father stepped back from active management 18 months ago and handed her regional oversight, she hadn't collapsed under it. She'd worked, she'd made decisions, she'd made some wrong ones, and she'd learned from them and made better ones after. But she had not yet fully learned the art of knowing when someone was using her. She went straight to the executive conference room on the 2nd floor, where Damien Brooks was already waiting with 2 members of the regional compliance team and a tablet propped open displaying what looked like a formatted incident report. He stood when she entered, always stood. It was one of the things he did that landed somewhere between respectful and performative. Victoria. He gestured to the chair at the head of the table as though he were seating her in her own company's room, which he technically was, but the gesture still managed to feel backward somehow. Thank you for coming out personally. I wouldn't have flagged this if it wasn't serious. She sat and pulled the portfolio open. Walk me through it. He walked her through it. He did so methodically, in the measured cadence of someone who had practiced the presentation. The story he told was structured and precise. A pattern of falsified safety logs in Sector 3 operations, multiple incident reports filed under incorrect dates, equipment maintenance records that showed signs of retroactive alteration, and a near-miss injury from 3 weeks ago that, according to his documentation, had not been properly reported to regional safety compliance, a violation that, if accurate, carried significant legal exposure for the company. The supervisor of record for all of it was Ethan Calloway. Victoria read through the documents he pushed across to her. The formatting was clean. The timestamps looked legitimate. There were digital signatures, cross-referenced records, a compliance breach timeline going back 4 months. Why are we only seeing this now? she asked. The pattern only became clear in the aggregate, Damien said. Individual reports looked minor. The full picture came together during the quarterly review cross-reference. I flagged it to legal the moment I understood the scope. Victoria turned a page. Has anyone spoken to Calloway directly about this? We didn't want to create a confrontation situation on the floor. Given the legal exposure, the recommendation from compliance and HR is immediate administrative suspension pending investigation. He paused. I understand this is difficult, Victoria. He's been here 6 years, but the documentation is what it is. And with OSHA exposure and what the insurance implications could look like if this became a formal complaint, I understand the implications. She closed the portfolio, sat quietly for a moment. There was something about it that didn't completely sit still in her mind, an edge she couldn't quite identify. Maybe the neatness of it. Real malfeasance rarely looked this organized, but she also knew that her instinct was not legal protection, and the documents in front of her were. I want a full investigation running simultaneously, she said. Not just the termination. I want every record independently verified. Damien nodded easily, too easily. Of course. That's exactly the right call. Set up the meeting with Calloway. I'll handle it personally. There was a brief pause, barely anything, less than a second, before Damien said, absolutely. But in that small pause, something moved through his eyes that wasn't agreement. It was something closer to satisfaction. Victoria didn't catch it. Later, she would. Ethan was in the middle of reviewing an incoming pallet manifest in Bay 4 when Marcus came to find him at 3:45. They want you upstairs, Marcus said. His voice was carefully neutral. Conference room. HR and somebody from corporate. Ethan looked up from the manifest. He read Marcus's face. Marcus's face said, I don't know how bad it is, but I think it might be bad. All right. He set the clipboard down on the pallet ledge. He took off his work gloves and tucked them in his back pocket. Small, deliberate movements. The kind you make when you want to look unhurried, even though something has gone cold in your chest. You want me to come? Marcus asked. No. He put his hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder. Keep the crew on task. Run the 4:30 shift check without me if I'm not back. He took the stairs up. Go. The woman sitting at the head of the conference table was younger than he'd expected for a Sterling. He'd seen her name, Victoria Sterling, Regional Director of Operations, on internal memos for the past year and a half, but he'd never been in the same room with her. She was composed in a way that took effort. He could see the effort, faintly, the way you can see brushstrokes if you're close enough to a painting. There was an HR coordinator named Linda Marsh to her right, and 2 legal liaisons from corporate that Ethan didn't recognize flanking the far end of the table. Damien Brooks was not in the room. Ethan noted that. Victoria looked up when he came in. She met his eyes directly, and he gave her credit for that. Whatever she was about to say, she wasn't going to hide behind paperwork. Mr. Calloway, she gestured to the chair across from her. Please sit down. He sat. I'm going to be straightforward with you, she said. I'm not going to dress this up in language it doesn't deserve. She slid a document folder across the table toward him. We have a compliance report that documents a significant pattern of falsified safety records in the sector under your supervision. Incident logs with retroactive date alterations. A near-miss event that wasn't properly reported. The documentation indicates this pattern spans approximately 4 months. Ethan looked at the folder. He didn't open it immediately. That's not accurate. I understand this is difficult to hear. No, I mean, it's not accurate in the literal sense. Those records are not mine. He opened the folder, scanned the first page. His jaw worked for a moment. These incident log timestamps are wrong. The signature on this one, he turned the document toward her and pointed, is formatted the way my signature looks when it's been digitally reproduced from a scanned copy. Mine has a specific break in the loop of the C that this doesn't have. Victoria leaned forward to look. She studied it for a moment. Mr. Calloway, Linda Marsh said carefully, we understand you may want to dispute the findings and the investigation process. I'm not disputing anything. I'm telling you the document is a fabrication. His voice was even, not raised. There was no heat in it. Something about that evenness was harder to look at than anger would have been. I have run this section of the floor for 3 years without a single unresolved safety violation. My actual incident logs are filed in the central system with original timestamps. Pull them and compare. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved between the document and Ethan's face. She had a very good instinct for when someone was performing composure versus actually feeling it. This man wasn't performing anything. He was simply clear. And the clarity made the folder in front of her feel suddenly heavier than it had 5 minutes ago. But the documents existed, and the legal team had already been briefed, and the exposure was real regardless of the truth, because exposure doesn't wait for truth to catch up. We'll initiate a full independent review of the records, she said quietly. But until that review is complete, company protocol under a complaint of this severity requires administrative suspension. He said it before she finished. Yes. Ethan sat back. He looked at the tabletop for a moment, not defeated, more like a man who had expected something but was still processing the shape of it now that it was real. Effective immediately? He asked. Yes. I'm sorry, Mr. Calloway. He looked at her then, and it was a specific kind of look. Not accusatory, not wounded, just searching, like he was trying to understand which version of wrong this was. Did you read all of it? He asked. Every page? I did. Did anything in it feel right to you? The question landed differently than questions usually did in rooms like this. Linda Marr shifted in her chair. The legal liaisons exchanged a glance, and Victoria Sterling, who prided herself on making clean, defensible decisions, felt something she did not have a professional name for move through her. The investigation will be thorough, she said. It was not an answer to his question. He recognized that. He nodded once, slowly. Then he stood, straightened his vest, the name tag, the one that said Ethan, supervisor, in plain block letters, and reached up and took it off. Set it on the table with a small, clean sound. He didn't storm out. He didn't threaten legal action in the room. He didn't raise his voice. He said, "Thank you for telling me yourself." Then he walked out. In the parking lot, he sat in his truck for 4 minutes without starting the engine. The afternoon was gray, the sky low and overcast, the kind of light that makes everything look flatter than it is. A forklift moved somewhere in the distance inside Bay 2. He could hear it through the truck window. Normal sounds. Work sounds. The sounds of a place that would keep going without him in it. His phone was in his hand. He didn't look at it yet. He thought about Sophie, about 340 pickup that Mrs. Pacheco was handling today, about the pasta in the wrong container in the refrigerator at home, about the water stain on the ceiling shaped like Florida. He thought about all of it simultaneously, the small architecture of the life he'd spent 9 years constructing around one person. Then he stopped thinking about it and made the call. It rang twice. The voice that answered was professional, unhurried, and expected him. Mr. Calloway. They did it today, Ethan said. A brief pause. Not surprise, more like confirmation of a scheduled item. Understood. I'll reach out to the oversight team within the hour. The protocol triggers automatically from here. Another pause. Are you all right? He looked through the windshield at the warehouse building, at the concrete walls and the loading docks and the parking lot with its unpatched potholes. I'm fine, he said. Just make sure the investigation is clean, real records only. Of course, that's all we've ever had. He ended the call, sat another moment, then he started the truck and drove to pick up his daughter. Sophie knew something was wrong before he'd said a word. She climbed into the truck at Mrs. Pacheco's with her backpack and her library book and looked at him for 2 full seconds with those direct, dark eyes. You're home early, she said. Little bit. Why? He pulled away from the curb. Work stuff. Nothing you need to worry about. She considered this with the particular skepticism of a child who has grown up watching one person manage everything alone and has learned to read that person the way you read weather. Is it bad? It's going to be fine, Bug. That's not what I asked. He glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead through the windshield, her small jaw set with an expression that was so familiar it hurt. It's a little complicated right now, he said. But I've handled complicated before. She was quiet for a block, then, Is this about that stuff at work you didn't tell me about last week? He frowned. What makes you say that? You were on the phone a lot. You always go outside to take calls when you don't want me to hear. He was quiet. I'm 8, she said. I notice things. I know you do. He exhaled. Yes, there's some stuff happening at work, people being unfair, but it's going to get sorted out, and I need you to just trust me on that, okay? Another long pause. Out the window, the neighborhood scrolled past. The dry cleaner with the hand-painted sign, the corner lot where someone had been building a fence since March, the elementary school 2 blocks from theirs that had a mural of a whale on the gymnasium wall. Okay, Sophie said finally, but if it gets really bad, you have to tell me. I'm not a baby. I know you're not. And I want eggs for dinner again, not pasta, he laughed. It surprised him slightly, the way it came out. Genuine and sudden, the way laughing is when you haven't expected to do it. Deal, he said. Sophie opened her book. Outside the truck window, the afternoon went on being gray and ordinary and full of things neither of them could yet see coming. That night, after dinner and dishes, and one chapter of the cartographer book read aloud and lights out, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a mug of coffee going cold beside him. He pulled up the centralized operations system. He still had login access until the suspension was formally processed, which typically took 24 hours, and began, quietly and methodically, pulling every record he had personally filed for the past 4 months. He did it the way he did everything at work, systematically, without gaps. What he found confirmed what he already knew. His actual records were clean, original timestamps, accurate dates, complete incident logs, nothing retroactively altered, nothing missing. What someone else had filed under his authorization credentials, however, was a different story entirely. There were phantom entries, log dates that contradicted physical records, safety assessments filed on days the facility had been closed, equipment maintenance certifications signed off on machinery that, according to actual maintenance records, had been out of service during the same period. It was remarkably done, not careless at all. Whoever had built this had put time into it, had understood the system well enough to create something that would pass a standard audit. They had not, however, counted on the fact that Ethan filed everything twice, digital and handwritten, the second set in a personal logbook he kept in his desk drawer out of a habit he'd developed in his second year on the floor, when a system crash had lost 3 weeks of entries and he'd spent 4 days reconstructing them from memory. Old-fashioned, redundant, entirely invisible to whoever had fabricated the digital trail. He photographed every page of the handwritten logbook with his phone, backed it up to 3 separate places. Then he closed the laptop and drank the cold coffee because he was too tired to make more. He sat in the quiet kitchen for a while after that. The refrigerator hummed. The upstairs neighbor's television bled faintly through the ceiling. Down the hall, Sophie slept without any idea of what had started moving today. The slow and inevitable machinery of a thing Ethan had set into motion with a 2-minute phone call in a gray parking lot. He thought about the woman in the conference room, Victoria Sterling, the way she'd looked at that document when he'd pointed out the signature, the shift in her face. She was not stupid. He'd seen enough people make dishonest decisions to know what that looked like, and what he'd seen in her wasn't dishonesty. It was something closer to doubt arriving too late. He didn't blame her, not completely. She'd been handed something that looked real by someone who knew how to make things look real, and she'd made a defensible decision. That was the trap of it. The trap had been designed well, but the trap had also just been sprung. Ethan turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. He was asleep by 10:15. His alarm was still set for 5:15. Old habits. Somewhere across the city, in a corner office on the 14th floor of the Sterling headquarters building, Damian Brooks was sitting with a glass of something expensive and a satisfied expression, reviewing the day's events and concluding, quite incorrectly, that he had won. He had no idea what was already moving. The morning after Ethan's termination, the warehouse ran the way warehouses always run when something has gone wrong at the top. Loudly on the surface, anxiously underneath. Marcus Webb ran the 7 o'clock floor check himself, standing where Ethan usually stood with his clipboard and his coffee, going through the shift manifest with the same deliberate attention to detail that Ethan had drilled into him over 3 years. He did it right. He always did. But the crew felt the absence the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue, constantly, involuntarily, unable to stop checking. By 8:30, the rumor had already moved through 2 shifts, some version of it, anyway. The version that travels fastest in a place like a warehouse is never the accurate one. What circulated that morning was a compressed and distorted shape of the truth. That Ethan had been caught falsifying records. That there were safety violations going back months. That corporate had come in yesterday and terminated him on the spot. The people who knew Ethan best, the ones who had worked under him for years, heard this version and felt the wrongness of it immediately, the way you recognize a bad translation of something you know by heart. But knowing something is wrong and being able to prove it are 2 completely different problems. Ray Dominguez, who had been on the floor longer than anyone and had worked alongside Ethan since his first year as supervisor, put it plainly to Marcus during the 9 o'clock break. "They're saying he falsified the logs," Ray said. He was leaning against the break room counter with his arms crossed and his coffee untouched, which for Ray was a significant indicator. Ray always drank his coffee. "Ethan, falsified safety logs." He said both sentences the same way you'd say the sun rose in the west this morning, just so the listener could hear how absurd it sounded out loud. Marcus looked at him. "I know. That man filed every incident report before the shift was even off the floor. I've seen him stay 40 minutes late to finish documentation that could have waited till morning. He just wouldn't leave it open." Ray picked up his coffee finally, looked at it, set it back down. "Whatever they've got in that compliance report, somebody put it there, and it wasn't him." "I know that too," Marcus said. "Question is what we do with knowing it." Ray was quiet for a moment. "We do our jobs," he said finally. "We keep everything documented, and we wait." It was not a satisfying answer, but it was the honest one, and both of them understood it. So that's what they did. They ran the floor clean, they documented everything, and they waited. What neither of them knew was that the waiting was going to be shorter than anyone expected. Linda Marsh had been in HR at Sterling Callaway Logistics for 7 years. She was methodical, thorough, and had the particular quality of someone who found genuine comfort in accurate records. Not because she was obsessive, but because she'd spent enough time cleaning up other people's messes to understand exactly what clean paperwork was worth. She was also, after 24 hours with the Callaway compliance file sitting on her desk, increasingly uncomfortable. It started with a small thing. The kind of small thing that is easy to dismiss in isolation, but refuses to stay dismissed once you've noticed it. She was cross-referencing the flagged incident reports from the compliance packet against the central HR database, standard procedure when an employee faced termination for documentation violations. When she noticed that one of the reports cited in the complaint referenced a safety drill conducted on the 15th of the previous month. The drill had, according to the compliance document, been improperly logged by Callaway with an incorrect date. The problem was that Linda remembered the 15th, not because it was remarkable in itself, but because it was the same day she had personally attended a company-wide systems update briefing that had required all department supervisors, including Ethan Callaway, to be in the main conference room from 9 in the morning until past 3 in the afternoon. She had the sign-in sheet. She always kept sign-in sheets. It was the kind of habit that HR people either have or don't, and Linda firmly had it. She pulled the sheet from her filing cabinet and looked at Ethan's signature on the attendance line next to the 9:07 a.m. entry. Then she looked at the compliance report, which claimed the improperly logged safety drill had taken place at 11 that same morning. A supervisor cannot conduct a floor safety drill from a conference room on the other side of the building. Linda sat with this for a long moment. Then she pulled a second report from the complaint file, then a third. She started building a side-by-side comparison. The compliance documents claimed timeline against the actual facility calendar she maintained, which included every scheduled event, supervisor obligation, and operational note going back 14 months. By 11:30 that morning, she had found 4 separate timeline contradictions. By 1 in the afternoon, she had 6, each one small enough to be overlooked in a standard review. All 6 together were not small at all. She picked up her phone, put it back down, picked it up again. The question she was sitting with was not a comfortable one. The compliance report had come through Damian Brooks' office. Damian Brooks was a senior regional executive who had been at Sterling for 3 years, who had the ear of corporate leadership, and who had, in her limited experience with him, always presented himself as someone who did things by the book. Raising a concern about his documentation meant raising a concern about him specifically. And Linda Marsh was a woman who had spent her career in rooms adjacent to power without being in it, which meant she understood clearly what happened to people who made the wrong accusation in the wrong direction. But she also had a sign-in sheet, and 6 timeline contradictions, and a terminated employee who had worked at this company for 6 years without a single substantiated complaint. She called Victoria Sterling's direct line at 1:47 in the afternoon. Victoria picked up on the 3rd ring. She sounded like someone in the middle of something. Linda? Ms. Sterling, I'm sorry to interrupt. I need 15 minutes with you today, if possible. It's about the Callaway file. A brief pause. Is it urgent? I think it might be, yes. Another pause, longer. Come up at 3. Linda gathered her folders, her sign-in sheets, her comparison document, and the 6 pages of time-stamped contradictions she'd spent the morning building. She also made a copy of everything and put it in an envelope in her desk drawer. Old habit, the kind you develop when you've worked long enough in corporate environments to know that paper has a way of disappearing when it becomes inconvenient. She went up at 3. Victoria looked at the sign-in sheet. She looked at the compliance report. She looked at the comparison chart Linda had built, which was organized by date in 2 columns, compliance document claims and verified facility records, with the contradictions highlighted in yellow because Linda was thorough even when she was scared. She didn't say anything for almost 2 minutes, just read, turned pages. Read again. You found 6 of these? She finally said. 6 that I can definitively verify against existing records, Linda said. There may be more. I only had this morning. Victoria set the papers down. There was a look on her face that Linda hadn't seen from her before. Not anger exactly, something colder. Who else have you shown this to? No one. I came directly to you. Good. Victoria was quiet again. She looked at the window for a moment, at the gray afternoon outside the glass. Then, I need you to keep this between us until I say otherwise. Don't discuss it with anyone in operations. Don't file anything. I need to make some calls first. Understood. Linda hesitated at the door. Ms. Sterling, whoever built that compliance report, they knew the system well enough to make it look real. That's not an amateur job. No, Victoria said quietly. It isn't. Linda left. Victoria sat at her desk for a while without moving. The thing she was feeling, she would realize later, was not surprise. It was something closer to the specific sick clarity of understanding that you've been used, that someone had handed her a script, and she had read it faithfully, had performed her part in it without ever knowing she was performing, and that the person who'd written the script had been sitting next to her in that conference room with his clipboard and his practiced reassurances, watching her sign her name to his work. She pulled out her personal phone, not her work phone, and called the company's outside legal counsel. Not the in-house team, the outside firm, the one her father had established a relationship with before he stepped back, the one that operated independently of Sterling's internal structure. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. When it was done, she sat for another moment. Then she called someone she hadn't spoken to in 8 months, a name that appeared on exactly one document in the entirety of Sterling Callaway Logistics' operational history, a document that lived in a sealed file in the company's legal archive, and that Damian Brooks, despite his years of navigating Sterling's internal systems, had apparently never thought to look for. The call connected. This is Ethan Callaway. Victoria paused. She hadn't expected to feel thrown by hearing his voice again. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Mr. Callaway, this is Victoria Sterling. She waited. I know who you are, he said. Not unkind, flat, but not hostile. I'm calling because there are significant questions about the validity of the compliance report that was used to justify your termination. My HR director has found timeline contradictions that I know, he said. She stopped. You know? I pulled my own records the night I was let go. My handwritten logs go back 3 years. None of what's in that compliance report matches them.
A pause. Ms.
Sterling, the records were fabricated. Not poorly. Whoever did it knew the system, but they didn't know I keep a parallel paper log. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Do you still have them? The handwritten logs? Photographed and backed up in 3 locations. She absorbed this. There's going to be an independent investigation. I want to be transparent with you about that. I also want to be transparent that there are larger questions here that go beyond your termination. She chose the next words carefully. Questions about the integrity of other documentation in this organization. The line was quiet for a few seconds. How large? He asked. I don't fully know yet. That's part of what the investigation will establish. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was the same, measured, unrushed, giving nothing extra. Do what you need to do, Ms. Sterling. The truth is in the records. It always was. He ended the call. Victoria sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, then set it on her desk and pulled up her email and began composing a message to the outside legal team with the subject line. Urgent, independent audit request, operational records Q, 1 to Q3. She worked until 8 that night. What Victoria didn't know, couldn't know yet from where she was standing, was that the investigation she was now initiating was going to intersect with something that had already been moving for 24 hours on a completely separate track. The phone call Ethan had made from the parking lot the previous afternoon had not gone to a lawyer in the conventional sense. It had gone to a man named Gerald Fitch, who was 61 years old, semi-retired, and had spent the better part of 3 decades as a corporate compliance specialist working on behalf of private stakeholders in complex organizational structures. Gerald was meticulous, unhurried, and expensive. He was also, in the particular way of people who have spent their careers doing one very specific thing extremely well, very good at his job. What he did in the 24 hours after Ethan's call was activate a clause in a 12-year-old legal agreement, an agreement that most people inside Sterling Calloway Logistics had no idea existed, because the person it protected had never had reason to invoke it, and had, until Tuesday afternoon, not wanted to. The clause triggered a mandatory external audit of all financial and operational records in any division under the Sterling Calloway umbrella in which the protected stakeholder held verified interest. This audit was not optional. It was not subject to internal management discretion. It was bound by the original incorporation agreement in language that predated the current executive structure entirely, which meant that Damian Brooks, who controlled most of what happened inside Sterling's regional operations on a day-to-day basis, had no mechanism to stop it, delay it, or know about it until it was already underway. Gerald's team had been quiet, methodical, and they didn't announce themselves. 2 external auditors, both contracted through the independent firm, arrived at Sterling Calloway's records management office on Wednesday morning with the appropriate legal authorization paperwork and began requesting access to 6 months of financial transaction records, vendor contracts, and operational budget allocations for the regional division. The records management clerk, a young woman named Priya, who had been in the role for less than a year, looked at the authorization documents for a long moment and then called her supervisor, who called his supervisor, who eventually called the regional operations director's office, which was Damian Brooks's office. Damian's assistant fielded the call. She relayed the information to Damian, who was in the middle of a lunch meeting with a vendor he had no legitimate reason to be meeting with, and she described the auditors and their authorization paperwork with the specific detail that Damian had trained her to provide. Damian went still when she finished. Something moved across his face that he controlled quickly, but not before the vendor across the table noticed it and filed it away. "Tell them I'll meet with them this afternoon," he said. His voice was smooth. "Give them access to the standard records archive for now. I want to review the authorization language before we open anything beyond that." He hung up, excused himself from the lunch table, and went to the bathroom where he stood at the sink with the water running and looked at himself in the mirror for 30 seconds. The authorization paperwork the auditors carried was not standard. He'd understood that immediately from his assistant's description. The specific clause language she'd read to him was not something that appeared in routine corporate audits. It was clause language he had seen exactly once before, years ago, in a due diligence review during the merger period, when he'd briefly encountered a sealed legal agreement and been told by Sterling's previous general counsel that it was legacy documentation from the original incorporation and not currently relevant. He had believed that. He'd moved on. He'd built everything he'd subsequently built on the reasonable assumption that the clause was dormant, and the party it protected was either unaware of it or uninterested in it. That assumption had just collapsed. He straightened his jacket. He turned off the faucet. He went back to the table and finished the lunch meeting without showing anything on his face, because Damian Brooks was, whatever else he was, genuinely good at not showing things on his face. But in the car afterward, driving back to the office, he called his personal attorney, not Sterling's legal team, and spoke in a low, rapid voice for 6 minutes. The attorney asked several questions. Damian answered them as fully as he could. There was a pause at the end of the call. "Damian," the attorney said carefully, "if the audit goes into the Q2 vendor contracts specifically, the regional subcontractor agreements, how exposed are you?" Damian looked out the windshield at the traffic moving slowly ahead of him. "Significantly," he said. A longer pause. "Then we need to get ahead of this before it gets ahead of us." "I know." He drummed his fingers once on the steering wheel. "I'm working on it." He wasn't working on it. Not in any way that was going to work. He just didn't fully know that yet. The audit team, in the meantime, was working steadily through the records archive with the unhurried efficiency of people who have done this many times and know that the truth is always in the documents if you read enough of them. They didn't need Damian's cooperation for most of what they were looking for. The authorization clause was specific enough that records management was legally obligated to comply regardless of what executive preferences said. Priya, who turned out to be more observant than anyone had given her credit for, quietly flagged several access anomalies she'd noticed in the digital record system over the past several months. Instances where administrative credentials had been used outside of business hours to access and modify operational documents, and added them, without being asked, to the auditor's growing file. By Wednesday evening, Gerald Fitch had received the first preliminary findings summary from his team. He read it at his kitchen table with his reading glasses on and a cup of tea going cold beside him, and then he read it again. Then he called a number and said, "It's bigger than what we thought going in." The person on the other end of that call was Ethan Calloway, who was at that moment standing in his kitchen helping Sophie finish a school project involving a poster board, 4 different colors of marker, and a confusing amount of glitter glue. "How much bigger?" Ethan asked. "The vendor contract irregularities go back at least 18 months. We're looking at fraudulent subcontracting agreements, redirected operational budget allocations, and what looks like a systematic pattern of record backdating across at least 3 departments. The Callaway termination wasn't isolated. It was designed to remove the one person on the operational floor with enough access and enough attention to detail to eventually see what was happening." Sophie looked up from the poster board. "Dad, the glitter glue is drying too fast." "1 second, Bug." He pressed the phone closer to his ear. "Gerald, what's the total exposure?" A pause. "Early estimates, and these are preliminary, I want to be clear, but early estimates put the fraudulent fund redirection somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 million over 18 months. Possibly more as we go deeper." Ethan was quiet. "Ethan," Gerald said, and there was something in his voice that had changed slightly. "This goes to the board. You understand that. This isn't a regional matter anymore." "I know. The question is how you want to approach the disclosure, given your position." "I want it clean," Ethan said. "No theatrics. The evidence speaks for itself. Just make sure everything is independently verified and documented before it goes anywhere near that boardroom." "Understood." A pause. "You're handling this very calmly." Ethan looked at Sophie, who had given up on the glitter glue and was now pressing purple marker against the poster board in large, deliberate strokes, the tip of her tongue visible at the corner of her mouth, the way it always was when she was concentrating. She looked up and caught him looking and gave him the flat, unimpressed face that was her default mode of affection. "I've had a couple days to get used to it," Ethan said into the phone. "Call me when the full report is ready." He hung up. Sophie pointed at the poster board. "It's supposed to say water cycle. Does that look right?" He looked at it. The letters were large, uneven, and enthusiastic. The A in water leaned significantly to the left. The C in cycle had somehow acquired a small spiral at the end that wasn't in the original plan. "Looks great," he said. She gave him a deeply suspicious look. "You're being nice about it." "I'm being accurate. Come on, what's left? The evaporation part?" "And condensation. And I spilled some glitter glue on the table." He looked at the table. There was, in fact, a substantial amount of glitter glue on the table. "Sophie, it was an accident." "How much of it was an accident?" A pause. "Most of it." He pulled paper towels from the counter. She slid off her stool to help. And for the next 20 minutes, they cleaned glitter glue off the table and finished the water cycle poster and argued pleasantly about whether condensation was more interesting than precipitation. And it was so normal and so small and so completely removed from $3 million fraud investigations that Ethan let himself disappear into it entirely. It was one of the things he was good at, being entirely where he was. He'd worked at it deliberately for years. Later, after Sophie was asleep and the apartment was quiet again, he sat with Gerald's words. The one person on the operational floor with enough access and enough attention to detail to eventually see what was happening. He had seen small things over the past several months, not enough to call fraud, nothing that would have stood alone as evidence of anything. A vendor invoice that seemed high for the service described, a subcontractor name on a procurement form that he didn't recognize, for a service category that didn't quite match the line items around it. A maintenance contract that appeared in the budget records without a corresponding physical work order. Each thing on its own was explainable. Together they formed a pattern he hadn't been close enough to fully read. He thought about Victoria Sterling, about the way she'd looked when he'd pointed out the signature on that document, the way her face had shifted, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the specific quality of a person whose understanding of something has just changed and who is working to catch up with the change. She had called him. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected the formal investigation and the legal machinery and the eventual exoneration through whatever process Gerald had set into motion. He had not expected her to pick up a phone herself and call, which meant she'd pulled his number from a file and dialed it personally rather than routing it through a legal team. That was a choice. People revealed things through their choices without realizing it. He didn't know what to make of Victoria Sterling yet. He knew she wasn't Damian Brooks. He knew she was smart and had been used. Beyond that, he reserved judgment because he had found over the years that giving people time to show you who they were was more useful than deciding early. He closed the laptop. The water stain on the bedroom ceiling, not Florida from this angle, more like a badly drawn boot, was the last thing he looked at before he turned off the light. In Sterling's headquarters building across the city, Linda Marsh was still at her desk at 9:45 at night, building a master document of every timeline contradiction she'd found, which was now at 11. She'd stopped being scared somewhere around 7 o'clock. She wasn't sure exactly when. It had happened somewhere between contradiction 8 and contradiction 9, when the pattern had become so clear that being scared of it seemed like the wrong response. The right response was documentation. So that's what she did. And Damian Brooks, in his apartment on the 14th floor of a building 20 minutes from the office, was on his third whiskey and his sixth phone call of the evening, working through a list of contingency options that were getting shorter with each call, though he hadn't fully accepted this yet. He was still operating on the assumption that there was a version of events he could construct that would hold. He was a man who had built things out of words and documents and careful timing for his entire career, and it was genuinely difficult for him to accept that the same tools could not be used to build a way out of this. The audit team's preliminary findings were already in Gerald Fitch's hands. Gerald's next step was a meeting with the outside legal firm that Victoria had engaged. Two investigations that had started from opposite ends of the same truth were now close enough to touch. It was Thursday. Ethan had been terminated for 48 hours. The board meeting was scheduled for Monday. Somewhere in the sealed legal archive at Sterling Callaway Logistics, in a file that hadn't been opened in years, a document sat with two names on it. A controlling shareholder agreement signed when the company was still being built, back when the Sterling name meant something different and the Callaway name meant something no one in the current executive structure had ever bothered to look for. It was about to mean something again. The weekend before the board meeting, Victoria Sterling did not sleep well. She told herself it was the workload, the volume of documentation the outside legal team had begun routing to her. The preliminary findings from the independent audit that arrived in her inbox Saturday morning in a 43-page PDF that she read twice through, once fast and once slow, with a highlighter in her hand that she forgot to actually use. She told herself it was the scope of what she was looking at, the professional weight of managing a crisis of this size in an organization that had her name on it now. But the thing that actually kept her awake, the thing she couldn't quite file under professional concern and move past, was the image she kept returning to of Ethan Calloway setting his name tag on the conference room table. The small, clean sound it made. The fact that he'd thanked her for telling him herself, as if basic decency in the delivery of an injustice was something worth acknowledging. She'd built a version of him in her mind from the compliance report, careless, or worse, deliberately dishonest, the kind of mid-level supervisor who cuts corners and hopes the paperwork covers it. That version had lasted approximately 4 minutes into the actual meeting, and she'd known it was wrong before he'd even pointed out the signature. Because men who falsify safety records do not sit across a table and look at you with that specific quality of stillness. They get defensive, or they get careful, or they perform indignation. They don't just look at you and say that's not accurate with the same tone they'd use to correct a math error. She'd known. And she'd signed the papers anyway. The audit report made it plain what she'd been part of. Not knowingly. The outside legal team had been clear about that, and Gerald Fitch's team had been equally clear. But the distinction between unknowing participation and clean hands was not one Victoria was inclined to be generous about when applying it to herself. She had the documents Damien put in front of her. She had the instinct that something was wrong. She had the authority to delay the decision. She had signed. On Sunday morning, she drove to the facility, not for any operational reason. She had a key card and the building was technically accessible to senior management on weekends for emergency purposes, but there was no emergency that required her physical presence in the warehouse on a Sunday. She went anyway. She told herself she wanted to look at the records room in person. She parked in the same lot she'd parked in the previous Tuesday, walked through the same side entrance, and stood for a moment on the floor of Bay 4 in the Sunday quiet, with the overhead lights on their motion sensor weekend setting, half the bay in shadow. The place was different, empty, larger somehow, or maybe just more honest about its own size. The smell was the same, metal and industrial lubricant and the particular dry cardboard scent of packaged inventory. The equipment sat where it was supposed to sit. Everything was where someone had put it, which meant someone had put it there deliberately and carefully because that was the standard that had been maintained on this floor. She stood there for a while doing nothing useful. Then she drove home, made coffee she mostly didn't drink, and spent the rest of Sunday preparing for Monday. The board meeting was called for 10 in the morning in the main conference room on the 16th floor of Sterling's headquarters building. It was not a regular scheduled meeting. It had been convened on an emergency basis by the company's general counsel, acting on the recommendation of the outside legal firm, with authorization from the 2 independent board members who sat on Sterling's Compliance Oversight Committee. The agenda, distributed Friday afternoon in a summary document that was deliberately spare on specifics, listed 3 items: operational compliance review, regional financial audit findings, and shareholder structure clarification. That third item was the one nobody on the senior executive team could quite account for. Damien Brooks had read it 4 times Friday evening and had spent the subsequent 48 hours trying to determine through his various channels what shareholder structure clarification meant in the specific context of this specific meeting, and had come back each time with nothing useful. It was the nothing useful that frightened him more than the rest. He arrived Monday morning in his sharpest suit. This was not accidental. Damien understood implicitly that how you looked when things started falling apart was a meaningful part of whether or not things continued to fall apart, and he had spent 20 years learning to project solidity so well that he had sometimes convinced himself of things the evidence did not support. He walked into the building at 9:40 with his portfolio and his practiced expression and the particular stride of a man who had somewhere important to be and was completely comfortable with that. He believed still that there was a version of this he could manage. The conference room on the 16th floor was larger than the one at the Maplewood facility. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides looking out over the city, a table long enough to seat 16 comfortably, a projector screen at the far end that was already lit. The 2 independent board members, Richard Hale and Susan Cho, were already seated when Damien arrived. Gerald Fitch was there, which Damien had not been told to expect, seated near the window with a leather briefcase and the composed expression of a man who has all the documents he needs. Two members of the outside legal team sat beside him. Victoria Sterling was at the far end of the table, and she looked up when Damien entered with an expression he couldn't fully read, which was unusual because he was very good at reading Victoria Sterling. Linda Marsh was there. That was unexpected too. She was seated near the door with a folder in her hands that she was holding with both hands, the way you hold something you've decided not to let go of. The company's CFO, David Park, arrived at 9:58, looking like a man who had been told less than he wanted to know and was trying to calibrate his anxiety accordingly. He sat across from Damien and didn't make eye contact. At 10:03, the door opened. Ethan Calloway walked in. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing dark pants and a plain charcoal button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. Clean, deliberate, but not performing anything. He looked like a man who had dressed appropriately for a meeting and had no interest in looking like anything other than what he was. He carried nothing except his phone in his hand, which he set face down on the table when he sat. He sat at the near end of the table, directly opposite the projector screen, and he looked at no one in particular when he entered, just found his chair and sat in it. Damien looked at him. Something cold moved through his chest. He didn't let it reach his face. Richard Hale, who was chairing the meeting, cleared his throat and began. He was 70 years old, had been on Sterling's board since the company's early years, and spoke with the measured economy of someone who understood that the fewer words used in a room like this, the better. We've called this emergency session on the recommendation of outside legal counsel and the independent audit team. I want to be clear from the start that this meeting is being recorded for compliance purposes and that everything said in this room is on the record. He looked around the table. We'll begin with the audit findings. Gerald. Gerald Fitch opened his briefcase and placed a bound document on the table in front of him. He did not pick it up. He spoke from memory, which was its own kind of statement. Over the past 4 business days, my team has conducted an independent review of operational and financial records for Sterling Calloway Logistics Regional Division covering the past 18 months. What we found can be summarized in 3 categories, with supporting documentation available for each. He paused. Not for effect. Ethan had known Gerald long enough to know he didn't do things for effect, just for accuracy. Category 1. Falsified operational compliance records. Specifically, the incident logs, safety assessments, and maintenance documentation submitted as the basis for the termination of warehouse supervisor Ethan Calloway last Tuesday. These documents contain a minimum of 11 verified timeline contradictions when cross-referenced against independently maintained facility records, HR documentation, and building access logs. The documents were not created by Mr. Calloway. Digital forensic analysis of the document metadata indicates they were created and backdated using administrative system credentials associated with regional operations, credentials that require director-level access to obtain. Damien's expression didn't change. He had prepared himself for this. He had prepared a measured, reasonable response that would introduce doubt, suggest alternative explanations, propose that the metadata could be misread. He had rehearsed it. Gerald continued. Category 2. Fraudulent vendor contracts. Beginning approximately 22 months ago, the Regional Operations Division began entering into subcontracting agreements with 3 vendor entities. Review of these entities reveals that 2 of them are shell companies with no verifiable operational history, no physical address, and no documented service delivery. Over the 18-month period under review, payments totaling approximately $3,800,000 were processed to these entities from Sterling Calloway's operational budget. These payments were authorized under the Regional Operations Director's signature. The room was quiet. Not the polite quiet of a meeting in progress, the specific quiet of a room in which the air has changed. David Park, the CFO, had gone slightly pale. He was looking at the document in front of Gerald with an expression that suggested he was doing rapid calculations in his head and not liking where they were landing. Category 3, Gerald said, is what we are calling the shareholder structure clarification, as listed on the agenda. He looked at Richard Hale. I'll defer to the legal team and Mr. Calloway for this portion. The outside legal counsel, a woman named Margaret Osei, who had the quiet authority of someone who had been in rooms like this many times, opened her own folder. As part of the audit authorization process, we reviewed the original incorporation documentation for Sterling Callaway Logistics in its current merged form. Within that documentation is a controlling interest agreement dated 12 years ago, at the time of the original Callaway Logistics Incorporation, which was subsequently carried forward into the merger agreement 18 months ago. She slid a copy of the document to each board member. This agreement establishes a 22% controlling interest stake held under confidential designation by a private party. The confidentiality provision was a condition of the original stakeholders' participation and has been maintained continuously since incorporation. The triggering clause in Section 14 of the agreement, which requires disclosure of the stakeholder's identity in the event of a formal compliance breach investigation involving the stakeholder directly, has now been activated. She paused. The controlling interest holder is Ethan Callaway. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Damien's practiced expression held for approximately 3 seconds. Then something cracked in it. Not dramatically, not the way faces crack in movies, but in the small specific way that a person's face changes when the ground they were standing on turns out not to have been ground at all. Richard Hale looked at Ethan. Susan Cho looked at Ethan. David Park looked at Ethan with an expression that had moved well past pale into something that was working through several phases of professional reckoning simultaneously. Victoria Sterling looked at Ethan. He was sitting in the same position he'd sat in since he arrived. Forearms on the table, hands quiet, looking at the document Margaret had distributed with the same measured attention he gave to everything. He looked, Victoria thought, exactly like a man who had known this moment was coming and had made peace with all of it well in advance. "Mr. Callaway," Richard Hale said slowly, "is there anything you'd like to say for the record at this point?" Ethan looked up. He took a breath. Not a dramatic one, just the breath of someone deciding where to start. "I'll keep it short," he said. "My father built the original Callaway Logistics from a two-dock operation in 1987. When I was 20, he brought me in as a working partner, not a figurehead. I learned the business from the floor up. When he died, I inherited the controlling interest, and when the Sterling merger was structured, I agreed to carry the interest forward under the same confidentiality terms because I had a 3-year-old daughter and I wanted to raise her without," he paused briefly, "without the complications that come with that kind of visibility. So I took a floor job, stayed operational, did the work I knew. And for 6 years that arrangement worked fine." He looked at the document on the table. "What I did not anticipate was that someone in a director position would spend 18 months building a fraud operation on the assumption that nobody was watching closely enough to see it, and then, when there was a risk of exposure, fabricate a termination case against the one person who might eventually piece it together." He said it without heat, without performance, just the clean, flat delivery of a person stating facts they've had time to understand. The room stayed quiet. Damien Brooks spoke for the first time since the meeting had started. "This is—" He stopped. He started again. "The metadata analysis is not conclusive. Document metadata can be altered. The vendor contract payments were authorized under approved budget frameworks. Damien," Victoria's voice came from the far end of the table. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Stop." He looked at her. "I was in that conference room with you," she said. "I read what you put in front of me. I signed papers based on what you told me." Her voice was even, but there was something moving underneath it that she was working to keep from the surface. "I am not going to sit here and listen to you try to find language that makes $3,800,000 in payments to companies that don't exist into something that needs more context." Damien's mouth closed. Richard Hale looked at legal counsel. "Margaret." Recommendation. Margaret Osei did not hesitate. Immediate suspension of Damien Brooks from all operational authority, pending formal investigation and board resolution. Referral of financial fraud findings to appropriate regulatory and law enforcement bodies. Independent restoration review of all operational records affected by the falsification. And formal reinstatement of Mr. Callaway's employment record with full clearance of all compliance flags. She paused. On that last point, however, I'd note that Mr. Callaway's status going forward is a matter for the board to discuss with him directly, given the disclosure of his shareholder position. Hale nodded. He looked at Damien. "Your access credentials will be suspended effective immediately. Security will escort you out after this meeting. Do not remove any materials from your office. He said it the way you close a door, firmly, without drama, with the finality of something that is simply done. Damien looked around the table. He looked at Victoria, who was looking at the document in front of her. He looked at Ethan, who was looking back at him with an expression that was not triumphant and not cold. It was just clear, like looking through glass. Whatever Damien had expected from this moment, and he had imagined variations of it over the weekend, had mentally rehearsed responses to accusations and constructed alternative narratives and prepared himself for the possibility that this was not going to go the way he needed it to go. He had not quite prepared himself for the specific experience of being looked at by the person he'd tried to destroy and finding no anger there. No satisfaction either, just clarity. It was, in some ways, harder to absorb than anger would have been. He didn't say anything more. When the security officer appeared in the doorway 10 minutes later, Damien gathered his portfolio and his prepared expression and walked out with the particular stiff dignity of a man who has decided that how he leaves a room is the only thing he has left to control. He was wrong about that too, but that was a problem for lawyers and regulators and time. The room breathed differently after he was gone. Richard Hale called a 5-minute recess that turned into 12 minutes while people moved around and spoke in low voices, and David Park had a brief and visibly intense sidebar with the CFO's legal advisor in the corner. Linda Marsh set her folder on the table with a quiet exhale, and Ethan watched her from across the room and caught her eye and gave her a small nod. She nodded back. She looked like a woman who had made a hard decision and was now on the other side of it and was still not completely sure what to do with that. Gerald came to stand beside Ethan during the recess. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Clean enough for you?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "It was clean." "The board's going to want to discuss your role going forward." "I know." "You've thought about what you want to say?" "More or less." Gerald looked at him. "You're not going to make it easy on them, are you?" "I'm going to tell them the truth," Ethan said. "That's generally not easy, but it's the only way I know how to do it." Gerald made a small sound that was close to a laugh. "Fair enough." When the meeting reconvened, Richard Hale addressed Ethan directly. "Given the now disclosed nature of your position within this organization, the board needs to formally discuss the question of your role going forward. Your controlling interest gives you significant governance rights that have been, by your own choice, dormant for 6 years. The board would like to understand your intentions." Every person in the room was looking at him. Victoria Sterling was looking at him. She had been looking at him at intervals throughout the entire meeting with the specific attention of someone who is trying to reconcile two different pictures of the same thing. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "I don't want the warehouse supervisor job back," he said. "I want it on record that I was terminated without cause based on fabricated evidence, and I want that record corrected completely. Every flag, every note, everything." He looked at Linda Marsh when he said it, and she was already writing. "For the employees on my floor who've been working under uncertainty since Tuesday, I want them to know as soon as possible that the operation is stable and that what happened had nothing to do with any of them." Hale nodded. "And beyond that, your shareholder position remains what it's always been," Ethan said. "I'm not looking to run this company. I never was. What I'm interested in is making sure it's run honestly." He paused. "The fraud that Damien ran through here, he didn't build it alone. He built it in a system that let him build it. Approved budget frameworks, as he called them, that apparently nobody checked against actual service delivery. Vendor authorization processes that didn't require independent verification. Record access controls that gave director-level credentials too much reach without oversight." He looked at the board. "Fix those things. Not because I'm telling you to, because they need to be fixed, and then run the company." Susan Cho, who had been mostly quiet through the meeting, spoke up. "You seem to have a clear understanding of what went wrong operationally." "I've been on the floor for 6 years," Ethan said simply. "I know where the gaps are. Would you be willing to consult on the remediation process? Not in an executive capacity, just your perspective on paper or in meetings as needed." He considered this for a moment. "If it helps, yes." Hale looked down the table at Victoria. "Ms. Sterling, you've been quiet." Victoria looked up. She had in fact been quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was still in the process of catching up to the full shape of what this meeting had turned out to be. She had come in prepared to manage a fraud crisis in her organization, which was bad enough. She had not come in prepared to discover that the man she'd terminated last Tuesday was the reason the organization she was managing existed in the form it did. "I owe Mr. Calloway an apology," she said. She said it plainly, without preamble. "I was given fabricated information, and I acted on it. I could have delayed the decision. I had an instinct that something was wrong, and I chose the legally defensible path instead of the right one." She looked at Ethan directly. "That's on me, not on the documentation. And I'm sorry." The room was quiet. Ethan looked at her for a moment. "I know you were used," he said. "I knew it in the conference room. That doesn't make what I did right." "No, but it makes it understandable." He said it without generosity as performance, just as a fact. "What matters now is what comes after." Victoria held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the board. "I'd like to personally lead the internal remediation review, if the board is in agreement. The structural vulnerabilities Mr. Calloway described, the oversight gaps, I want those corrected under my direct supervision. And I want every employee whose record was affected by Damien's falsification identified and cleared." She paused. "Starting with the 14 people on Ethan's floor who've spent the last week thinking their supervisor was a fraud." Hale looked at the other board members. There was a brief exchange of the particular eye contact that happens between people who have known each other long enough to communicate without words. Then he looked back at Victoria. "Agreed. The board will formalize that authorization by end of day." The meeting ran another 40 minutes on procedural matters, timelines for the regulatory referral, interim management structure for the regional division, a press communication framework for when the situation became public, which Margaret Osei noted was likely within 72 hours. Ethan answered questions when asked and was quiet when not asked, which was, everyone in the room gradually understood simply how he functioned. When it ended, people filed out in the particular dispersal of a meeting that has been dense and consequential, slowly, in small clusters, with the slightly disoriented quality of people who have been inside a pressurized space and are readjusting to ordinary air. Ethan was gathering his phone from the table when Victoria appeared at the far end of the room. The others had mostly gone. Gerald was by the door speaking quietly with Margaret. Linda Marsh had left first, already on her way back to HR with a list of names she intended to start on before lunch. Victoria crossed the room. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him with the directness she'd shown in the smaller conference room last Tuesday, the quality of meeting someone's eyes and not looking away from what you find there. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "Why didn't you—" She stopped, reformulated. "You've had this position for 12 years. You had every mechanism available to you to prevent what happened, to protect yourself, to expose what Damien was doing the moment you had any indication." She paused. "Why did you wait?" It was a real question, not rhetorical, not accusatory. She genuinely wanted to understand. Ethan thought about it for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give her the real one, not the easy one. "Because I didn't know what Damien was doing until Gerald's team found it. I knew something felt wrong, but I didn't have the evidence." He looked at the projector screen, still lit, still showing the last page of the audit summary. "And because the clause, the one that triggered the investigation, I didn't want to use it. Using it meant this." He gestured at the room in a way that took in the whole meeting, everything that had happened in it. It meant disclosure. It meant the company becoming a crisis instead of a company. The people on my floor, Marcus, Ray, all of them, they don't benefit from their workplace turning into a legal emergency. He paused. "I used the clause because what Damien built was big enough that I didn't have another option, not because it was what I wanted." Victoria absorbed this. "That's a strange set of priorities for someone with your resources." "It's the right set," he said. "For me." She looked at him for another moment. There was something working in her expression that was more personal than professional, something she hadn't entirely decided to show him, but was showing him anyway. "You could have told me in that conference room," she said quietly, "who you were.
You could have stopped the whole thing in 30 seconds. I could have. Why didn't you? He met her eyes. Because I wanted to see what you'd do when you found out you were wrong. He said it simply, without cruelty, but completely honestly.
That matters more to me than who someone is when they have all the information. Victoria was quiet. Something moved through her face that she didn't try to manage. And, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. You called Linda's office before you called your legal team, he said. And you called me from your personal phone. He picked his phone up from the table. That's a reasonable start. He walked to the door. Gerald fell into step beside him. Victoria watched them go. She stood in the empty conference room for a moment after the door closed. The city was visible through the glass walls, gray-skied and ordinary, and going about its business 14 floors below, without any idea of what had just happened in this room. She looked at it for a while. Then she sat back down at the table, opened her laptop, and started on the list of names. Ethan was in the elevator when his phone buzzed. A text from an unsaved number that he recognized anyway because he'd seen it on the school's automated system for 2 years. Sophie Calloway checked in at 8:07 a.m. Attendance confirmed. He looked at it. He was not a man who got sentimental easily, or at least he'd spent enough years managing the impulse that it didn't show much. But he stood in the elevator on the 14th floor of a building where his name had just been restored and his daughter's future had just been secured in ways she would probably never fully know about. And he felt the weight of the past 6 days settle through him and then begin, very slowly, to lift. The elevator opened. He walked through the lobby and out into the gray Monday morning air. He had to be at Mrs. Pacheco's by 3:15. Sophie had a library book due this week. He needed to remember to check which one. He drove. The news broke on Wednesday morning, 48 hours after the board meeting, in the form of a press statement issued jointly by Sterling Calloway Logistics' legal team and the outside counsel firm. It was carefully worded, the kind of statement that says the necessary things without embellishing them, which is its own kind of statement about the people who wrote it. It confirmed that a senior regional executive had been suspended pending investigation into financial irregularities. It confirmed that an independent audit had identified significant compliance concerns in the regional division. It confirmed that affected employee records were being reviewed and corrected. It did not mention Ethan Calloway by name. That had been his specific request, delivered through Gerald the night before the statement went out. Gerald had relayed it to the legal team without editorializing, and the legal team had honored it without argument, partly because it was a reasonable request, and partly because the man making it held 22% of the company. What the statement did not and could not control was everything that happened after it landed. By noon on Wednesday, the story had been picked up by 2 regional business publications and 1 national trade outlet that covered logistics and supply chain. By 3 in the afternoon, it had migrated to general business news. The framing was consistent across most of the coverage. Senior executive removed, millions in fraudulent vendor payments, falsified safety records used to terminate an employee whose subsequent identity had triggered the investigation. Most outlets got the broad shape of it right. A few got details wrong in ways that were irritating but not harmful. One ran a headline that described Ethan as a secret billionaire living as a warehouse worker, which was inaccurate on multiple levels, but had the particular quality of a headline that spreads regardless of its accuracy. Ethan read that one on his phone while standing in his kitchen Thursday morning and made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "What?" Sophie said from the bar stool without looking up from her cereal. "Nothing. Article about work stuff." She looked up. She had been tracking the situation with the particular attention she gave to things she'd been told not to worry about, which meant she had absorbed significantly more than Ethan had explicitly shared. "Is it the thing about you being a billionaire?" Ethan looked at her. "Where did you hear that?" "Ava's mom showed Ava something on her phone, and Ava told me at lunch yesterday." She returned to her cereal with the expression of someone delivering a mildly inconvenient weather report. "Are you a billionaire?" He set his coffee down. He pulled out the bar stool next to her and sat on it. He hadn't planned this conversation for this morning, but Sophie had a way of scheduling conversations according to her own timeline, which bore no relationship to his. "The company is worth a lot of money," he said. "I own a piece of it. That's been true for a long time." She processed this. Her spoon moved in slow circles through the cereal. Why didn't you tell me? Because it didn't change anything about how we live. And because you were 3 when I made the decision to keep it private, so telling you wasn't really an option at the time. I'm 8 now. I know. So why didn't you tell me when I was older? He looked at her. The question was fair, and she knew it was fair, and she was waiting for an answer that matched its fairness. This was what Sophie did. She had inherited, from somewhere, the specific quality of expecting honesty and having a highly calibrated detector for when she wasn't getting it. Because the life we have right now is the one I wanted for you, he said. The apartment and the school and Mrs. Pacheco and butterscotch. That's real. The money. The business stuff. That's real too, but it's complicated in ways that change things. I didn't want it to change things for you before you were ready. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Did it change things? Some things, he said. The people at work who were doing wrong things got caught. That happened faster because of who I am in the company. Is that why you got fired and then unfired? More or less? Another pause. Longer. She was working through something. He waited. So are we going to move? She asked. Her voice was slightly different on this one, still flat, still even, but with something underneath it that was not flatness. No, he said immediately. We're not moving. She looked up. You promise? I promise. He held her gaze. The apartment. The school. Mrs. Pacheco. None of that changes. I told you the important stuff stays the same, and I meant it. She looked at him for another moment with those dark, direct eyes. Then she went back to her cereal. Okay, she said, and then after a beat, but can we get a better container for the pasta? He stared at her. The round one with the good lid, she clarified. Since apparently we have money. He put his hand over his eyes for a moment. Yeah, he said, we can get a better container. Okay. She closed the subject entirely and picked up her library book from beside the bowl. The case was closed. This was Sophie's version of acceptance. She asked the real questions, got the real answers, and then moved on without ceremony. It was one of the things about her that exhausted him and made him prouder than he could ever adequately explain. He drove her to school. She didn't wave, per the agreement. He sat in the parking lot for slightly longer than usual. Then he drove to Sterling Calloway's headquarters for the first of what would become a series of working meetings that he had agreed to but hadn't entirely prepared himself for the reality of. The reality of it was this. Fixing a company that had been systematically exploited from the inside for 18 months was not a clean or simple process. It was slow and frustrating and full of moments where the right answer and the defensible answer were not the same answer, and someone had to make the call about which one to follow. Victoria Sterling was making most of those calls. Ethan was, as he'd agreed, consulting. But the line between consulting and deciding blurred almost immediately because Victoria had the instinct to ask the right questions, and Ethan had the specific operational knowledge to answer them. And when those two things are in the same room together, the work just moves. The first meeting was in a small conference room on the 12th floor, not the main boardroom, because Victoria had made the deliberate choice to work in smaller rooms for this phase. She'd said when Ethan asked about it obliquely, "The boardroom is for performance. I don't want to perform right now. I want to work." It was a reasonable distinction, and he respected it. Linda Marsh was at most of these meetings. She had become, in the days since the board meeting, a person who walked into rooms differently than she had before. Not with more authority exactly, but with the specific confidence of someone who has been right about something important and has stopped apologizing for it. She'd compiled the master list of affected employees by Tuesday evening, 17 people total, whose records had been touched by Damien's falsification scheme, either directly as named parties or as secondary documentation references. Ethan's record was the most significant, but it was not the only one. There are 3 cases where the falsified documentation was used to justify denied promotions, Linda said in the first full working meeting 3 days after the board session. She had her folder open and her reading glasses on, and she spoke with the direct clarity of someone who had spent a career being careful and was now being rewarded for it. 2 employees in regional ops who were passed over for supervisor roles based on compliance flags that we now know were fabricated. One technician in facilities management whose raise was denied citing documentation that doesn't match his actual work record. Victoria looked at the names. I want personal meetings with each of them, not HR meetings. I want to sit with them myself and explain what happened and what we're doing about it. She looked at Linda. Can you set those up? Linda nodded. I already have them tentatively scheduled pending your confirmation. Victoria looked at her. How many hours did you work last week? Linda paused. I don't track it that way. Linda. A lot, Linda said in a tone that closed the subject. Ethan was watching Victoria through this exchange. There was something he was still adjusting to about her, the way she moved through the remediation work. She was not the person he'd expected based on the conference room interaction 9 days ago, which was itself already a more complicated picture than he'd initially had. She was, when she wasn't managing external appearances, impatient with process and careful with people, which was an unusual combination. She had strong opinions and stated them without dressing them up, and she was genuinely bad at delegating the things she cared about, which meant she was consistently overextended and consistently present. She was also, he was slowly understanding, harder on herself than the situation required. She came back to the fact of having signed the termination papers with a regularity that was starting to function less like accountability and more like punishment. He called her on it on Thursday afternoon, at the end of a 3-hour session working through the vendor contract audit and the regulatory referral documentation. Everyone else had left the room. Victoria was still at the table with her laptop and 4 open folders, and the specific posture of someone who has been sitting too long and is ignoring it. You know the regulatory referral covers what happened, Ethan said, collecting the copies of the audit summary from the end of the table. Once that's filed, the fraud piece is in the right hands. I know, she said, not looking up. And the employee remediation timeline is realistic. Linda's got it organized. I know. So what are you still working on at... He checked his phone. 6:45. She looked up at that, looked at the time. Something moved across her face that was close to frustration, but at herself. I keep finding more gaps, she said. Every time I think I understand the full scope of what Damien built into the operational structure, there's another thing, another approval pathway with insufficient oversight, another authorization chain that's essentially one person deep. She sat back. He built it in the existing weaknesses. The company already had them. He just used them. Most fraud works that way, Ethan said. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be comforting. It means the structural work is the actual job. The Damien part is over. The system part is what's left. He paused. Which you already know. She looked at him. Then why are you saying it? Because you're sitting here alone at 6:45 treating the system fixes like they're the thing you should feel bad about rather than the thing you actually have to do. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She had the expression of someone who has just been accurately described and is deciding how to respond to it. You're very direct, she said. You've mentioned that before. I wasn't complaining. She closed the laptop, leaned her elbows on the table and rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands in a gesture that was entirely unpolished and entirely human. I was actually thinking it might be useful in someone I'm supposed to be working with. You are working with me. On a consulting basis. Temporarily. She dropped her hands, looked at him. The board asked me to propose a framework for ongoing oversight. The shareholder structure gives you governance rights that are currently being exercised. Your word. As minimally as possible. That's your choice. But it's also a gap. The company needs someone in a meaningful oversight role who isn't susceptible to what Damien was doing, and who has enough operational knowledge to actually catch it early if it starts again. Ethan sat on the edge of the table. He didn't respond immediately. I'm not asking you to run the company, she said. You've made your position on that clear enough. But in an advisory governance role, not decorative, not ceremonial, actually functional, that's not running the company. That's watching it the way you've always watched it, just with the authority to act when you see something. He looked at the window. The city was going dark outside, the buildings across the street lit from the inside in the early evening way that made them look almost warm. He thought about Marcus Webb running the floor check the morning after his termination, doing it right because that's what Marcus did. He thought about Ray Dominguez with his untouched coffee, saying whatever they've got in that report, somebody put it there. 14 people who had kept doing the work correctly while the structure above them had been quietly corrupted. If I take a governance role, he said, it's on specific terms. Tell me the terms. The floor gets a direct reporting mechanism to the oversight committee, not through regional ops management, directly. If someone on the operational level sees something that looks wrong, there's a path that doesn't go through the people who might be doing the wrong thing. Victoria nodded. That's a good structural fix regardless. Employee remediation isn't just record correction. The 2 people who were passed over for promotions on fabricated grounds get reconsidered for those roles on their actual merits. The technician gets back pay for the raise period he was denied. Already planning that. And he paused. This one was different from the structural items. The people on my former floor know what happened. They've had a week of uncertainty and rumors. I want to go back there, not in an official capacity, just to talk to them. Tell them personally that the situation is resolved and that the operation is stable. Victoria looked at him. You want to go back to the warehouse? To talk to my crew? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. That's not a governance term. That's just something you need to do. Maybe. It's still a condition. She almost smiled. It was a specific kind of almost smile, the kind that appears when someone says something you recognize as true, but slightly stubborn. Agreed, she said. All of it. She paused. Is that the full list? For now. For now, she repeated, with a tone that acknowledged there would probably be additions. She extended her hand across the table. It was a deliberate gesture, not a reflex. She'd made a choice to do it. Then we have a working arrangement, Mr. Calloway. He looked at the hand, then he shook it. Ethan, he said. Victoria, she said. He picked up his copy of the audit summary. Go home, he said. The gaps will still be there tomorrow. She watched him leave. Then she sat in the quiet conference room for another minute, looking at the table before she finally closed her folders and started packing up. She was not by nature a person who trusted quickly. She had reasons for this that were specific and personal and not something she examined often. But she was aware, sitting in that room, that she had spent the past week watching a man navigate a situation that most people would have leveraged for maximum personal advantage, maximum public vindication, maximum visible retribution, and had instead treated it as a systems problem to be solved and a set of people to be protected. She didn't know entirely what to do with that observation. She just knew it was accurate. She drove home and made dinner for the first time in several days, and it was not a good dinner. She had overcooked the rice and the sauce was too thin. And she ate it anyway, and it tasted fine. The visit to the warehouse happened Friday morning. Ethan drove out to Maplewood alone in his own truck, arriving at 7:50 before the full-day shift had settled into its rhythm. Marcus Webb saw him from across the floor and stopped what he was doing and just stood there for a moment. Then he walked over. He looked at Ethan the way you look at someone after a week that has contained more information than you've had time to process. You look the same, Marcus said finally, for someone who's apparently been secretly running the joint. I wasn't running anything. That's what a secret owner would say. Ethan put his hand out. Marcus took it and held it a beat longer than a handshake usually runs. Floor looks good, Ethan said. Floor always looked good, Marcus said, because you trained us right. He paused. You're not coming back, are you? Not to the floor? No. Marcus nodded. He had expected this. Good, he said, which surprised Ethan slightly. I mean it. You should be somewhere where someone can't just... He stopped. Started again. You belong somewhere you can do more, man. Always did. The floor was... We were lucky to have you, but... He shook his head. You know what I mean. I know what you mean. Ray Dominguez appeared from Bay 3, saw Ethan, and walked over with his coffee actually in his hand and being drunk, which Ethan noted as a meaningful indicator. There he is, Ray said. No drama. Just acknowledgement, the way Ray did everything. Within 15 minutes, most of the crew had gravitated to Bay 4, which was the largest open space on the floor. Not organized, not called together, just the natural movement of people who wanted to be in the same place. Ethan stood in the middle of it and felt the specific weight of 14 people looking at him and didn't make it a performance. "I know the past week has been a mess from where you were standing," he said. "Rumors, uncertainty, the place running without clear information about what happened and why." He looked around the group. Marcus, Ray, the younger crew members who had only been here a year or two, Priya from records management who had apparently come down from upstairs because word had gotten to her. The short version: the compliance case against me was fabricated. The person who fabricated it was using the position to run financial fraud through the company. That's been exposed, and it's being handled by people with the appropriate authority. Your jobs are secure. The operation is stable. Nothing that happened has anything to do with how any of you do your work, which has always been right. Silence for a moment. Then one of the younger crew members, a kid named Derek, 22 years old, had been here 8 months, worked hard and asked good questions, said, "So you're like a billionaire?" Several people looked at Derek. Derek looked back at them, unapologetic. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Ethan looked at Derek. "I own a portion of the company. The company is worth a significant amount." "Yes." "And you were working here as a supervisor," Derek said, working through it out loud. "For 6 years." "Yes." Derek took a moment with this. "That's wild," he said, with the specific tone of someone delivering a genuine assessment rather than judgment. "Like, genuinely wild, man." Ethan heard Marcus make a sound beside him that was definitely suppressed laughter. "I know," Ethan said. He couldn't quite keep the corner of his mouth from moving. "I know it's wild." Ray looked at him over the rim of his coffee cup. "You gonna miss it? The floor?" Ethan looked around Bay 4, the pallet racks and the equipment and the overhead lights and the dock doors standing open at the far end with the gray morning coming through. He thought about 8 hours a day in this air, about knowing every inch of the inventory system, about the specific satisfaction of a shift that ran clean and a manifest that reconciled perfectly and a crew that trusted you with the work. "Yeah," he said, "I'm going to miss parts of it." Ray nodded. He understood what parts. Ethan stayed another 30 minutes, which turned into an hour. He answered questions, some operational, some personal, some in the specific category of Derek being curious. And he walked the floor one more time with Marcus and looked at everything Marcus had built and maintained in his absence and told him plainly that it was good work and meant it. When he left, Marcus walked him to the parking lot. They stood by Ethan's truck in the gray morning air. "You still got my number," Marcus said. "I do. If you need anything, or if—" Marcus paused, working on something. "If you ever want to just come by and walk the floor, you know, off the clock, you're allowed to do that." Ethan looked at him. Something in his chest that had been tight for 10 days released slightly. "I know I am," he said. "I might take you up on it." "Good." Marcus put his hand out again. They shook. "Go do the big stuff, man. You got people here who've got the floor." Ethan drove back into the city with the morning traffic moving around him and his hands easy on the wheel and the particular feeling of something having been properly finished, the way a thing feels when you close it at the right moment, rather than letting it just drift away. The regulatory referral was formally filed that same Friday afternoon, routed to the appropriate financial oversight authority, and copied to the relevant law enforcement contacts that Margaret Osei had identified. Damian Brooks, who had spent the week in his apartment on calls with his personal legal team, received notice of the referral through his attorney at 4:17 in the afternoon. His attorney called immediately and spoke for 9 minutes in the careful language of someone managing expectations downward. Damian listened without saying much. When the call ended, he sat in the specific silence of a man who has run out of next moves. He had spent his career in the space between what was documented and what was real. Understanding that most organizations have a gap between those two things, and that the gap can be used by someone patient enough and skilled enough to use it. He had been both of those things. He was also, it turned out, a man who had looked at every person around him as a variable to be managed, and had therefore never fully believed that any of them would hold the line when it cost them something to do so. Linda Marsh had held the line. It had cost her several sleepless nights and a significant amount of professional nerve. She had done it anyway. Ethan Calloway had held lines his entire adult life, at a cost that Damien had not understood because he had not believed the cost was real. These were the things that had undone him in the end. Not a dramatic intervention, not some brilliant exposé, just people doing the right thing at the right time, slowly and imperfectly, until the weight of it became more than the wrong thing could carry. Damien would eventually face a formal investigation that would take 14 months to complete and would result in charges that his legal team would negotiate down from their original scope but could not eliminate. He would not go to prison, which was a fact that bothered several people and satisfied no one entirely, but the financial penalties and the permanent bar from executive roles in any regulated industry were not nothing. He would spend the years after it living smaller and quieter than he had built himself to live. And whether he spent any of that time thinking about the people he had tried to use and discard was something nobody on the other side of it ever found out or much cared about. The afternoon the regulatory referral was filed, Victoria sent Ethan a text. Not a work communication. She had sent those by email throughout the week with the appropriate formality. This was her personal number, which she had not explicitly given him, but which appeared on his phone the way phone numbers do when someone uses them to call you, and then the record just stays. The text said, "It's filed. I thought you'd want to know directly." He looked at it for a moment. He was in his truck in the headquarters parking lot about to drive to pick up Sophie. He typed back, "Thank you for doing it right." A pause. Then her response, "That's a low bar." He wrote back, "Most people don't clear it." Another pause, longer. Then, "Fair point. Have a good weekend, Ethan." He put the phone in his pocket and started the truck. Sophie was in a mood when he picked her up. Not a bad mood exactly, more the specific restless energy of a Friday afternoon when school has been long and boring and the weekend feels like it should have already started. She got into the truck and immediately said, "Can we get pizza?" "Hi to you too." "Hi. Can we get pizza?" "What happened to eggs?" "Eggs are for the week. Pizza is for Friday." She said this with the confidence of someone announcing a law of nature. He looked at her. She had a streak of what appeared to be purple marker on the side of her hand from some project he didn't know about yet. Her ponytail was messier than the morning version, which was saying something. She was looking at him with the expectant patience of someone who already knows the answer and is waiting for the other person to arrive at it. "Yeah," he said. "Pizza." She nodded as if this had never been in doubt, which from her perspective it genuinely hadn't, and picked up her library book. He pulled out of the school parking lot into the Friday afternoon traffic, the city around them busy and loud and entirely indifferent to the week that had just passed, and that indifference was, in its way, a kind of relief. He had spent 9 years building a life that was small by the standards of people who count size in money, and large by the standards of the things that actually hold. A daughter who asked the real questions and then moved on. A crew that ran the floor right even when he wasn't there. A record that had always been accurate, even when someone had tried very hard to make it look otherwise. These were not nothing. He had always known they were not nothing. But sitting in traffic on a Friday with Sophie reading beside him and pizza somewhere in the near future, he felt the truth of it settle in a different way than knowing it. The kind of settling that doesn't come from everything going right, but from everything having gone wrong in the specific ways it did, and finding out that what you'd built held anyway. He didn't say any of this out loud. Sophie was on page 47 of the cartographer book and had no patience for philosophical reflection on a Friday afternoon. But the feeling was there, quiet and specific, the way real things are. The pizza place they went to was a counter-service spot 8 blocks from the apartment with red Formica tables and a laminated menu that hadn't changed since at least the previous decade, and that Sophie approached each time with the seriousness of a document that might have new information in it since the last visit. She got the same thing she always got. Ethan got the same thing he always got. They sat across from each other at the corner table by the window, with the street outside going about its Friday business, and Sophie told him about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Ava about whether the Underground Railroad in the cartographer book was better than the one in a different book Ava was reading. And Ethan listened and asked questions at the right moments, and outside the window the city moved and the week folded up behind them into something that had happened and been survived. His phone buzzed once during dinner. He turned it face down without looking at it. Whatever it was could wait. It could wait. The months that followed did not move the way dramatic things are supposed to move in stories. They moved the way actual time moves, unevenly, with stretches of ordinary days between the significant ones, with progress that looked like nothing from inside it and only became visible when you turned around and measured the distance from where you'd started. October became November. The regulatory investigation into Damian Brooks's financial fraud moved through its procedural stages with the grinding patience of institutional process, which meant it was thorough and slow and mostly invisible to everyone except the lawyers managing it. The $3.5 million in redirected funds was partially recovered through asset seizure proceedings that Damian's legal team contested at every stage and lost at most of them. The shell companies were formally dissolved. The two vendor entities that had been real but had overbilled under arrangements Damian had structured were audited separately and required to return the margin difference. It was not satisfying in the way that justice looks satisfying from the outside. It was paperwork and hearings and negotiated outcomes, and the specific exhaustion of a process that exists to be correct rather than dramatic. Margaret Osei told Victoria in November, during a brief update call, that this was what accountability actually looked like most of the time. Movies give people the wrong idea, she said. Real consequences are administrative. They're boring and they're binding and they last longer than a verdict does. Victoria thought about that for a while after the call. She thought about the version of justice she'd been expecting. Something visible and clean, a moment that felt like the right ending, and about how the actual ending was a series of documents and proceedings and slow corrections that didn't have a single frame you could point to and say there, that's when it was over. It was just over, eventually, the way infections clear. Not all at once, in stages, until the day you realized you hadn't thought about it in a week. The employee remediation work was different. That moved faster and mattered more immediately to the people it touched. Linda Marsh sat with each of the 17 affected employees personally. She had prepared for these conversations carefully, not scripted, just prepared, the way you prepare for something you intend to get right. She explained what had been found, what had been corrected, and what the company was doing to ensure it didn't happen again. She did not use the language of corporate apology, which tends to be approximately 40% actual apology and 60% liability management. She used plain language. She said, "We got this wrong. Here is what wrong looked like specifically for you, and here is what we are doing to correct it." The two employees who had been passed over for promotions on fabricated grounds were reconsidered through a genuine review process. One of them, a woman named Carla Reyes, who had been a regional operations coordinator for 4 years, was offered the supervisor role she had originally been denied. She accepted it after 3 days of consideration, during which Linda did not pressure her in either direction. The other employee, a man named Josh Teller, was offered the role and declined it. He'd moved on mentally during the months of being overlooked, had started taking night classes in a different field, and the role no longer fit the direction he was building toward. He was given back pay for the period of the denial and a formal written clearance for his employment file that he could take anywhere. He shook Linda's hand when they finished and said, without bitterness, "I just needed to know it wasn't real." Linda understood what he meant. The fabricated record had made him question his own competence for months. Knowing it was fabricated didn't restore the time he'd spent doubting himself, but it restored something else. The accurate picture of who he'd actually been in that job, which was good at it. That distinction mattered. Linda had not expected how much it would matter to people, and it changed how she did the rest of the meetings. She stopped leading with process and started leading with, "What you did here was real and it was right, and nobody took that from you. They only temporarily obscured it." The technician, a quiet man named George Abramowitz, who had worked in facilities management for 9 years and had a habit of fixing things nobody had asked him to fix because he noticed they needed fixing, received his back pay and a letter of formal commendation for the access anomalies he'd flagged to the audit team. He read the commendation letter in Linda's office with a slightly skeptical expression, as if waiting for the part where something was being taken away, and when it became clear there was no such part, he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket and said, "All right then." It was, Linda felt, The most satisfying meeting of the entire remediation process. Ethan knew about each of these outcomes because Victoria kept him informed, not because the governance structure required it, but because she had decided early that the oversight role he'd agreed to meant he was actually kept in the loop on the things that mattered, not just the things that were formally his business. She sent him updates in the direct, minimal style she used for everything. Facts first, context where necessary, no diplomatic padding. He read them the same way and responded the same way, and somewhere in that exchange pattern, a working rhythm developed that neither of them had explicitly designed. The governance framework he'd agreed to was formalized in October in a board resolution that established an independent operational oversight committee with Ethan as its chair. The committee had 3 members: Ethan, an external compliance specialist recommended by Gerald Fitch, and 1 rotating board member. And its mandate was specific: direct access to all operational divisions, independent reporting mechanisms from floor-level employees, and quarterly reviews of authorization structures and access controls. It was not a flashy role. It did not come with a large office or a staff or any of the visible apparatus of corporate authority. It came with work, which was the part Ethan had agreed to. He did it from home mostly, and from a small office at the headquarters building 2 days a week, and occasionally from the Maplewood facility when he wanted to walk the floor and look at the actual operation rather than representations of it in documents. Marcus always knew when he was coming, which meant the crew always knew, which meant things were in slightly better order than usual on those days, which Ethan noted and said nothing about because the floor was in good order on the other days too, and the slight extra polish on his visit days was just people being human about being seen by someone whose opinion they cared about. He and Victoria had coffee for the first time in mid-October. Not a meeting, a coffee. She had been coming out of a long session with the outside legal team when she passed him in the corridor near the elevator and said, without quite planning it, "I need coffee that isn't from the machine on 12. He had looked at her for a moment and then said, "There's a place 2 blocks east." She had said, "Give me 5 minutes." She had taken 8, which he waited for without impatience, and then they had walked 2 blocks east through the gray October afternoon to a coffee shop that was narrow and slightly too warm and had exactly 4 small tables, all of them occupied, so they stood at the counter by the window with their cups and talked. It was the first conversation they'd had that wasn't about the company. It started slightly awkwardly, because neither of them had much practice at the transition between professional and personal, and both of them were aware of the awkwardness, which made it more awkward briefly before it became less so. She asked about Sophie, which was the easiest entry point, and he answered in the way he always answered questions about Sophie, directly, with the specific warmth of a person who doesn't perform their affection for their child, but also doesn't conceal it. She listened with an attention that wasn't polite attention. It was actual attention, the kind where you ask the follow-up question because you want to know the answer. "What's the cartographer book?" she asked when he'd mentioned it in passing. He explained it. She looked genuinely interested, not in the performing interest way. "She sounds like someone who's going to be a lot to keep up with in a few years," she said. "She's a lot to keep up with right now," he said. "I'm already behind." Victoria almost smiled at that. Almost, and then actually. It was a different smile than the professional version, smaller and less managed and more real. He noticed it and didn't say anything about it, which was the right call. She told him about her father stepping back from the company, which she hadn't discussed with him before. Not the professional version of that story. The version where a senior executive transitioned to a governance-only role and the next generation assumed operational leadership. The actual version, which was messier and more complicated and involved a man who had built something over decades and loved it, and also could not entirely let go of it even after he'd handed it over, which created a specific dynamic that was loving and difficult in equal measure, and that Victoria navigated with more patience than she gave herself credit for. "He still calls twice a week," she said, "with suggestions. Do you take them?" "Some of them, the operational ones, I usually ignore. The people ones are usually right." "What's the difference?" She thought about it. "He doesn't always understand how the business works now, but he understands how people work the same way he always did, and that part hasn't changed." She paused. "He asked about you, actually. After the board meeting, he'd heard about it." Ethan looked at her. What did he ask? He asked if you were someone I could work with. She looked at her coffee cup. I said yes. He said, good. Those are the ones worth keeping. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside the coffee shop window, the street did its ordinary afternoon things. A delivery truck double parked. 2 people walked past with a dog that was trying to go in 3 directions simultaneously. He sounds like a reasonable man, Ethan said. He has his moments. She said it with the particular affection that contains history. They walked back to the building after that. In the elevator, she said, same time next week? And he said, 2 blocks east. And she said, obviously. And that was how it started. Which is to say, it started the way most real things start. Without announcement, without anyone deciding it was starting, just a pattern that appeared and then continued because stopping it would have required more effort than continuing it, and neither of them wanted to make that effort. November of the coffee became lunch once, on a Thursday when the morning meetings had run long and neither of them had eaten and someone had to make a decision about food. Sophie found out about it approximately 4 days later, which was 4 days faster than Ethan had expected. And the discovery happened the way Sophie discoveries usually happened, through observation rather than information. He had been on the phone after dinner, walking the length of the kitchen, the way he did when he was thinking and talking at the same time. And whatever he said in the last 2 minutes before he hung up had a different quality than his work calls. Sophie looked up from her homework at the kitchen table and watched him set the phone down and stand there for a moment with a particular expression she hadn't cataloged before. Who was that? She asked. Someone from work. Sophie looked at him with the full force of her 8-year-old assessment capabilities. Which someone? He looked at her. Victoria. A pause. Sophie looked back at her homework. Did 3 math problems. Then, without looking up, is she nice? Yes. Does she know about me? Yes. Sophie nodded slowly, still looking at the homework. Okay, she said, and then, because she was Sophie, she should come to dinner sometime so I can decide for myself. Ethan stood in the kitchen for a moment. You want to vet her? I want to meet her, Sophie said primly. There's a difference. Is there? Yes, vetting is what companies do to employees. I just want to have dinner. She looked up and gave him the flat, direct look. Unless you don't want me to meet her. I didn't say that. Then invite her to dinner. She went back to the math problems as if the matter were settled, which from her perspective it was. It took him 3 weeks to actually do it, which was cowardice of a fairly ordinary kind. The kind where you know something is the right move and you postpone it anyway, because making it real changes something you're still getting used to the idea of changing. Victoria, for her part, accepted the invitation with a directness that suggested she'd been waiting for it and had decided not to be the one to suggest it herself. She came on a Wednesday evening in late November, carrying a box of bakery cookies because she had asked Ethan what Sophie liked, and he had said chocolate chip, and she had taken that at face value and gotten good ones from an actual bakery rather than a grocery store, which was the kind of decision that reveals something about a person. She stood in the doorway of the apartment for a moment when Ethan opened it, taking in the actual space of where he lived, the ordinary furniture and the library books stacked on the end table and the school project on the refrigerator, with an expression that was adjusting itself to what it actually was rather than what it had imagined. Sophie was at the kitchen table with her cartographer book, which Ethan knew she had positioned herself there on purpose because it was the most natural-looking version of being somewhere to observe someone arriving. She looked up when Victoria came in and did a full 3-second assessment that she did not attempt to disguise. Victoria looked back at her without flinching from the assessment, which was the right move. I'm Sophie, Sophie said. I know, I'm Victoria. She set the cookie box on the counter. Your dad said chocolate chip. Sophie looked at the box, then at Victoria. From the bakery on Clement Street? Victoria glanced at Ethan. He hadn't specified. Yes, actually. Those are the good ones, Sophie said with the gravity of a serious endorsement. She went back to her book. The assessment was apparently complete, or at least the first phase of it was. Dinner was pasta, the right container, the round one with the good lid that they'd gotten in October, which Sophie had mentioned to Victoria within approximately 7 minutes of sitting down to eat, explaining the whole container situation with the thoroughness of someone presenting a case study. Victoria listened to the container explanation with complete seriousness and said, "The seal integrity matters more than people give it credit for." Sophie looked at her with an expression that said she had just been understood correctly on an important point. After that, the conversation moved more easily. Ethan mostly listened. He was not a person who needed to fill silence at a table, and what he was doing was watching two people he cared about, in different ways, at different depths, with histories that were entirely separate. Find the small common ground that becomes possible when nobody is performing anything. It was not smooth. Victoria said something about her father's company once, and Sophie asked 3 follow-up questions in rapid succession that were slightly more pointed than polite, and Victoria answered them honestly, rather than deflecting, which Sophie noticed and filed. Ethan knocked his water glass with his elbow at one point and caught it without spilling most of it, but not all of it. And Victoria handed him a napkin and Sophie said, "That happens every time. He always does it with that glass." And Victoria said, "Is there a specific reason you keep using that glass?" And Sophie said, "I've been asking the same thing for 2 years." And Ethan said, "I like the glass." And both of them looked at him with identical expressions of patient incomprehension, which was the moment Ethan understood that something had shifted in the room without anyone announcing the shift. After dinner, Sophie showed Victoria the cartographer book, not offered it to read, just showed her, explaining the plot with the detailed confidence of someone who has processed a story thoroughly and wants to know if you're going to understand its significance. Victoria sat on the couch and listened, and asked about the Underground Railroad and about the grandmother character, and about what Sophie thought was going to happen in the last third of the book. And Sophie told her in detail, and then said, "What do you think?" "I think the grandmother already knows the cartographer's secret," Victoria said. "I think she's known the whole time, and she's waiting for her to figure it out herself." Sophie stared at her. "That's what I said to my dad 2 weeks ago." "What did your dad say?" "He said he'd have to read it to have an opinion." Sophie looked at Ethan with mild judgment. "I've been busy," Ethan said. "You're always busy." But she said it without real complaint, just fact, because she knew it, and she also knew that busy had recently meant something that had affected more people than just them, and she was 8 and imperfect and sometimes impatient, but she was not ungrateful. Victoria left at 8:30. Sophie had school in the morning, and the routine was the routine. Ethan walked her to the door, and she stood in the hallway with her coat, and she looked at him and for once didn't immediately say something, which was unusual for Victoria Sterling. "She's remarkable," she said finally, meaning Sophie. She said it quietly, like it wasn't for anyone but him. "I know," he said, the same way he always said it, because he did. She nodded once. "Thank you for dinner. Thank you for the cookies. She's going to ask you to come back. Is that okay?" He looked at her in the hallway light, which was not flattering light. It was the overhead fixture in a rental apartment corridor, fluorescent and unforgiving. And she looked exactly like who she was, which was a woman who was smart and overextended and harder on herself than the facts required, and genuinely trying to do the right thing in a company that had been used against its own people, and who was standing in a hallway asking a real question without dressing it up in anything. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay." She left. He stood in the doorway for a moment after she'd gone to the elevator, then closed the door and went back inside where Sophie was already in her pajamas with her book and a very studied expression of someone who was not going to make a big deal of anything. "She can come back," Sophie said, without looking up. "Good," Ethan said, "but she should bring the cookies from Clement Street again." "I'll pass that along." "Okay." She turned to Paige. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, Bug." He turned off the kitchen light. The apartment settled around him in the way apartments do at night. The refrigerator hum, the upstairs television, the particular quiet of a space where the day is over and nothing is being demanded. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark, not thinking about anything complicated, just standing in the kitchen of his apartment, which was small and ordinary and fully his. The company's restructured oversight framework was formally adopted by the board in December. The new vendor authorization protocols required independent verification before any contract over a certain threshold could be processed. Access controls were restructured so that no single director-level credential could modify records without triggering a parallel log review. The floor-level reporting mechanism went live with a simple, direct process, a secure submission system that routed concerns to the Oversight Committee without passing through the chain of command that might have interest in suppressing them. It was not a perfect system. No system built by people for people to operate is perfect, but it was significantly better than what had been there before, which had been essentially nothing wearing the costume of something. Ethan reviewed the final framework document in January, sitting in his small office at headquarters on a Tuesday afternoon. He read it with the same attention he had given to incident logs for 6 years on the floor, looking for gaps, for language that was vague where it should be specific, for authorization chains that were one person deep when they should be two. He found 3 places where the language needed tightening and sent the notes to the legal team. He found one place where the reporting mechanism had an additional step that would discourage people from using it and sent that note to Linda. He found, overall, something that was genuinely better than what it replaced, which is as much as you can reasonably expect from remediation work. He sent Victoria a message. Framework looks solid. 3 language notes going to legal, 1 usability fix to Linda. Otherwise, it's good work. She wrote back within a few minutes. The floor reporting mechanism was Linda's design. Tell her directly. He wrote to Linda. The reporting system is well designed. People will use it. Linda sent back a response that was 1 sentence and contained a thank you that was brief and slightly formal, which was Linda's version of being moved. February arrived, and with it the 6-month mark since the Tuesday that had started all of it. Ethan didn't track the anniversary consciously. It surfaced in the way dates sometimes do, unbidden, while he was doing something unrelated. He was making eggs on a Saturday morning when the awareness of it landed. 6 months since he'd driven to work on an ordinary day and come home unemployed. 6 months since he'd sat in a parking lot and made a phone call he'd hoped he'd never have to make. He stood at the stove and thought about the shape of 6 months and what had changed in them and what hadn't. Sophie was in 4th grade now, deep into a new book series about a girl who discovered she could speak to bridges. Not metaphorically, literally, the bridges talked back, and had opinions about every installment that she delivered at dinner with prosecutorial focus. She had grown approximately an inch since October, which Ethan had noticed and which she denied, as if height were a negotiation. She was doing well in school and badly in patience, the latter being a consistent feature rather than a development. She had asked Victoria 3 specific questions about running a company during a Saturday afternoon visit in January, and had taken careful note of the answers in a way that suggested she was filing them somewhere for future use. When Ethan had asked what she was planning to do with that information, she had looked at him and said, "I don't know yet. It's good to know things early." He had thought about that for a while after. It was not wrong. Victoria had been to the apartment 4 more times since November, not always for dinner, once for a Sunday morning where she'd brought coffee and they'd both worked at the kitchen table for 2 hours while Sophie did homework nearby, and everyone existed in the same space without it requiring management. That was the visit that had mattered most to Ethan, not because anything significant happened in it, but because nothing significant needed to. It was just a Sunday morning and 3 people in a kitchen and the ordinary weight of shared space, and it was comfortable in the way that things are only comfortable when they've been earned. He and Victoria were not in a relationship in any defined or announced sense. They were 2 people who talked often and had lunch regularly and had spent a Sunday morning working in his kitchen, and who had both decided, apparently without discussing it, that naming the thing was less important than continuing it. This was probably cowardice again, the ordinary kind, but it was also something else. It was the specific caution of 2 people who had both seen what happens when you move fast without looking at what you're moving toward, and who had decided that looking carefully was worth the time. They would get there. They were already there, in most of the ways that mattered. The rest was just time. Marcus Webb was promoted to floor operations manager in February, the role that had been open since Ethan's departure. He accepted it with the specific undemonstrative satisfaction of a man who has been doing a job at the level above his title for years and has finally been recognized for it rather than just relied on. He called Ethan the afternoon the offer came through, not to ask for advice, the decision was already made, but because Ethan was the person he wanted to tell first. "You saw it coming," Marcus said. "I told them in October," Ethan said. Told Victoria directly. The person running this floor is already Marcus Webb. You're just not paying him accordingly. A pause. You did that? It was accurate. Another pause. Longer. Ethan. Man. Don't get sentimental on me, Webb. I'm not sentimental. His voice was doing the thing it did when he was sentimental. I'm just, saying. I know, Ethan said. You've got the floor. Yeah, Marcus said. I've got the floor. Ray Dominguez stayed. Carla Reyes took her supervisor role and spent the first 3 months being harder on herself than necessary, which Linda told Victoria about and Victoria told Ethan about, and Ethan, the next time he walked the floor, spent 20 minutes talking to Carla about the Bay 4 inventory system in a way that was about the inventory system and also, underneath it, about the fact that she belonged in the role, and everyone on the floor already knew it, and she could stop trying to prove it and just do it. Carla listened and didn't say much, and the next week her crew reported to Marcus that she'd stopped second-guessing herself in the shift meetings. Small things. The kind that don't make news and matter anyway. Priya, the records management clerk who had flagged the access anomalies to the audit team without being asked, was given a formal commendation and a role expansion that came with a title change and a pay increase. She accepted it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had noticed something wrong and reported it because that was the correct thing to do, and who viewed recognition as appropriate but not particularly the point. George Abramowitz fixed 3 things in the facilities department that nobody had put on the work order list, including a drainage issue in Bay 2 that had been a low-level problem for 2 years and that he resolved with parts he sourced himself on a Thursday afternoon. He put the receipt in the expense system and wrote Bay 2 drainage, completed in the work notes field, and that was the end of it. George Abramowitz was the same person he'd been before any of this happened. That was, in its way, the most satisfying outcome of all. Spring came, as it does, without asking permission. The city bloomed in the specific reluctant way of cities that have been gray for months and haven't quite decided to commit to warmth yet. A week of real sun followed by 2 cold days, then back again, the temperature negotiating with itself. Sophie started a school project about architecture that consumed a weekend and required Ethan to explain load-bearing walls in terms that satisfied her, which took longer than he expected because she had follow-up questions that he did not have complete answers to, which led to him actually looking things up, which led to Sophie saying, "I knew you didn't know about load-bearing walls," with an expression of vindication. Victoria came to Sophie's school science fair in March. Ethan had not asked her to come. Sophie had, directly, in a text she'd sent from Ethan's phone while he was in the other room, which he found out about after the fact, and which Victoria had responded to with, "I'll be there." When he found out, he stood in the kitchen looking at the message thread with a feeling he didn't have a precise name for, but that was adjacent to the feeling of looking at the water stain on the ceiling first thing in the morning, something constant that you stop trying to explain and just accept as part of the landscape. The science fair project was about water cycle systems and used the poster board from 6 months earlier as a reference model, though Sophie had made a new version for the actual fair because the original had too much glitter glue in the wrong places. Victoria stood in front of it and asked questions that were specific enough that Sophie had to think before answering, which Sophie clearly considered the correct standard for engagement. They stood there talking about condensation for 6 minutes while Ethan stood slightly to the side and watched and thought about how strange and specific life was. That the Tuesday everything fell apart had led, through a chain of decisions and confrontations and documents and phone calls and pasta containers, to this gym on a March afternoon. He did not think this made the original wrong right. The people who had been hurt by what Damien built had been hurt. Linda's sleepless nights were real. The months of self-doubt that Josh Teller had carried were real. The work of making it right was slow and imperfect, and some of the costs had been permanent. That was true, and he held it as true. The fact that other things were also true alongside it did not cancel it out. Both things existed together, the way things usually do in lives that haven't been edited. But standing in that gym on a March afternoon, he held both things and found that he could. That evening, after the science fair and after dinner and after Sophie had gone to bed, He and Victoria sat on the small couch in the apartment living room with the television on low to something neither of them was watching, and Victoria said without particular lead-up, "I've been thinking about something." He looked at her. "What?" She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how direct to be. She usually decided on very direct. "I've been thinking that I owe you more of an apology than the one I gave you in the boardroom." He started to say something. She kept going. "I know what I said in the boardroom, and I know you accepted it, but I keep thinking about the fact that you spent 6 years on that floor, 6 years building something careful and right with those specific people, and doing it honestly in a context where nobody knew who you were, and it would have been so easy to be different, to use what you had, or to just coast, and you didn't. You just did the work." She looked at the television without seeing it. "And then someone I had authority over used a position I gave him to try to take that from you, and I signed papers without looking hard enough, and I've spent 7 months thinking that the boardroom apology covered it." She looked at him. "I don't think it does." He was quiet for a moment. He had a quality she'd come to recognize in these months. When he was thinking about something real, he went quiet in a specific way, not evasive, just careful, like he was measuring what he was about to say against the truth of it. "The boardroom apology was real," he said. "I knew that when you gave it." "That's not the point." "I know it's not." He turned slightly toward her on the couch, the way you turn toward something you're taking seriously. "The thing you're describing, the 6 years on the floor, I didn't do that as a test for anyone. I did it because it was the life I wanted, for Sophie and for myself." He paused. "What you did in the conference room, you made a defensible call on bad information. I've thought about it a lot. I've thought about whether I'd have done different in your position, with those documents in front of me and that specific legal pressure and someone I trusted telling me it was clear, and I don't know. Maybe I would have delayed it. Maybe I wouldn't have." He held her gaze. "You called Linda before you called your lawyers. You called me from your personal phone. You drove to the warehouse on a Sunday morning when nobody asked you to." He let that sit for a second. Those weren't the actions of someone who did something wrong and was trying to manage the damage. Those were the actions of someone trying to get it right. Victoria looked at him. Something in her face that had been held carefully for 7 months relaxed slightly. Not entirely. She was not a person who let things go entirely, but slightly. "You're very difficult to stay guilty around," she said. "You shouldn't be guilty. You should just know what you do differently and do it next time." "I do know." "Then that's enough," he said. "That's all any of us can do." She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a different tone, smaller, less managed, "Ethan." "Yeah. I think I'm—" She stopped, tried again. "This, whatever this is, I think I want it to be something I can say out loud." He looked at her. The television made a low sound. Outside the window, the city did what cities do at night, indifferent and ongoing. The apartment was warm and slightly cluttered with Sophie's library books and a school project, and the pasta container on the counter, and the particular lived quality of a place where real life has been happening without apology. "So say it," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Something in her face settled into something quieter and more honest than her professional expression and more open than her cautious one. "I'm in," she said. Simple, direct, the way she did most things when she stopped overthinking them. He nodded. "Okay." "Okay," she said. They sat on the couch and the television played quietly, and outside the apartment, spring was deciding to commit to itself at last. And neither of them said anything else for a while because everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything else could be whatever it was going to be. Ethan Calloway had never measured his life against the size of what he owned. He had measured it against simpler things. Whether Sophie had what she needed, whether the work he did was honest, whether the people he was responsible for were treated right. These were not glamorous standards. They didn't appear in the kind of profile that publications run about powerful men. They were just the standards he had chosen when he was young and lost and had a 3-year-old daughter who needed him to be steady, and he had kept them because they had turned out to be the only ones that held. The Tuesday, everything fell apart, had tested them. The machinery of corporate fraud and fabricated records and institutional pressure had tried to demonstrate that those standards were a liability, that a man who did his job honestly and kept careful records and refused to coast on what he had was just a target, just a person who could be used and discarded because he'd made himself invisible. What it had demonstrated instead was that the records were real, that the people who saw him work knew what they'd seen. That honest work, done over years in full view of everyone around you, builds a kind of evidence that is very hard to fabricate because it lives in other people. Marcus Webb knew. Ray Dominguez knew. The 14 people on the floor knew. And eventually, through Linda Marsh's sign-in sheet and Priya's flagged anomalies, and Victoria Sterling's decision to call him from her personal phone instead of routing it through legal, the truth had moved back into the open where it always belonged. He had not been vindicated by power. He had been vindicated by a woman in HR who kept sign-in sheets because she found comfort in accurate records. That was the shape of it. That was the actual shape. April came. Sophie turned 9 on a Wednesday. She requested the eggs with no rubber quality and a specific flavor of cake from the Clement Street Bakery, and both requests were honored, and Victoria came for the occasion and brought the cartographer book sequel, which Sophie had not yet gotten from the library, and which was received with the first genuinely unguarded expression of delight that Ethan had seen Sophie direct at another person in quite some time. She tried to play it cool for approximately 4 seconds before giving up and reading the back cover with visible excitement. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his daughter sitting at the table with her new book, and the woman who had brought it and felt, without trying to name it more precisely than it needed to be named, that the thing he had built across 9 years of early mornings and honest work and careful love was still standing, more than standing. It had grown, imperfectly, unexpectedly, through a crisis he hadn't chosen and a loss that had turned out to be temporary, and a series of choices made by ordinary people who had decided, at the moments that counted, to do the right thing. The water stain on the ceiling still looked like Florida, or a boot, depending on the angle. The pasta was in the right container. The morning alarm was still set for 5:15. Some things stay the same because they're supposed to, and some things change because they were always going to, and the only question was whether you'd be honest enough to let them. Ethan Calloway had always been honest enough. That was, in the end, the whole story.